Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Batson Church's celebration event, Flying to the Future. We came up with that name on the fly and it just stuck. So thank you all for being here today. I appreciate some of you have come a long way and it might have been a difficult journey. So just want to say how much we appreciate the effort people have made to come along. So I'm just going to do a quick housekeeping announcement. Fire exits are over here and the way you came in at the back there. There is no fire drill today. So if the fire alarm does go off, it is the real thing, and we will need to assemble just outside. But I'm hoping we'll be fine on that front. So just want to also say that today we've got a lot of speakers. We wanted to hear from as many people as possible. So we're not doing Q&A after the talks, but everyone who's speaking will be around across lunchtime and at the end of the day. So please save your questions up. Have I forgotten anything? No, I think that's it. So without further ado, we will get going. Please welcome BCT Director of Conservation, Lisa Werledge.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you ever so much, Kate. It's my absolute privilege to have the first talk today and to welcome you all to this absolutely fabulous venue. I can't think of anywhere more appropriate for today's session. As Kate said, I know it's been a big commitment for quite a number of you, and we've got people with us today from right across England, which is fabulous. We've got an interesting day ahead of us with some great talks and discussion. And as Kate said, there's going to be plenty of opportunities for conversations during breaks, as well as looking at the fantastic displays and just enjoying this beautiful venue. I was having fun with the button earlier, so bear with me. Hey, there we go. Lovely. So, as many of you will know, the Batson Churches project is a partnership of the Church of England, the Churches Conservation Trust, Historic England, Natural England, and the Bat Conservation Trust. We all bring our own expertise and perspectives, with funding from the National Lottery Heritage Fund and additional financial support from the partners and the All Churches Trust. I'm going to set the scene for where the project came from, how it came about, and its scope of work. As most of you know, the project is coming to an end, or rather to the end of its 5-year delivery phase in November. But the history of the project... there we go. But the history of the project goes back much further than those years of delivery. Surveys 30 years ago found a significant proportion of pre-16th century churches house bats. The issues that the presence of bats in churches may cause has led to many a headline, to the campaign group to get bats out of churches, and even bills in Parliament. Back in November 2011, I assisted with workshops in Norfolk for a University of Bristol study. That day was truly eye-opening for me. I'd only started work at BCT a few months before. By listening to the church communities represented at those sessions, I was introduced to the issues of what bats in churches can mean at their worst. The smell of ammonia from bat urine, the mess of bat droppings, the damage to our incredible heritage and the fabric of beautiful church buildings, and the work required by church communities on top of everything else to deal with those issues and to look after the churches with large bat populations. But I also heard those in church communities who celebrated their bats. And chatting over the washing up after the sessions, it was clear that there could be common ground between different communities. And the need for collaboration was understood and is understood by the partners who came together from such different perspectives when they developed the Bats in Churches project. A recurring theme you're going to hear across today is about finding that common ground and of partnership working. The project is about people. It's about people. It's about heritage, and it's about bats. Partnership and listening to each other have been at the heart of Bats in Churches from its inception, through its delivery, and will continue into its legacy. This can be seen in all 4 of the main project work areas. One of the largest work streams of the project has been with capital works at churches, bringing together conservators, architects, ecologists, as well as church communities. This has included some very large-scale works, including new ceilings with bat voids, extensive cleaning of heritage furnishings, and supervision of roof restoration works. In efforts to reduce their impact, spaces have been created specifically for bats in a variety of ways, beneath roof tiles, in eaves, boxing in above timbers, and even the use of heated bat boxes. One important aspect of this work stream was to come up with innovative ideas and solutions, and you're going to hear about some of those ideas today. But a huge learning point for us has been that it isn't necessarily the most expensive actions that deliver the greatest benefit. Some relatively simple and low-cost solutions, such as the provision of covers to protect pews, have actually made a significant difference in some cases. So money doesn't necessarily equal success, as we'll hear in another talk this morning. Work around engagement has simply been vital for the project. What's been achieved would not have been possible without working closely with church communities, some of which have even made their bats a living natural asset for their church, drawing in whole new sections of their local communities. The project and the engagement officers have helped people of all ages, including school groups, to connect with their regional histories and their local natural environment. There have been some engagement activities that I don't think we'd thought of when we were first developing the project. Some of the team appearing on Songs of Praise. The beautiful multimedia artwork that we have here by Irene Stearns and Phil Atkin that the project commissioned. So please do enjoy that in the breaks. The highly desirable Bats in Churches badge for uniform groups has been a really useful tool in reaching out to the next generation. And something that you all have in your delegate packs, again, we hadn't thought of at the start of the project, was that 2 of the team members would become published authors as a result. And as I say, you've got a copy of their fab book, The Little Church Bat, in your packs today. Its publication was the result of hard work, but it had contributions from all of the project partners. Historic England provided input about the house that was demolished in the story. I hope I'm not giving too much away. BCT gave guidance on the bats, and the Church of England and the Churches Conservation Trust advising about the church and its interior to ensure the book was technically correct, as well as being a great story, with its origins about a real church. It may be aimed at young people, but it's an enjoyable read for those of us who, shall we say, are perhaps a bit more just young at heart these days. So, there we go. So our engagement officers have worked with PCCs to enable them to manage the cleaning and maintenance of their churches. And this has been supported by our training programme, with workshops on church cleaning from the project's heritage advisor, teaching people how best to clean bat urine and droppings from a variety of surfaces and objects. There's a cleaning guide that can be downloaded from our website, and if you're quick, there are some copies on Antia's table as well. And we've got some training videos that will be released soon. We've trained bat volunteers to survey churches, not just for the project's research, but also volunteer bat roost visitors to give them confidence in supporting churches through Natural England's free bat advice service. There have been workshops for professionals too, aimed at ecologists, architects and heritage building specialists. There's been training for churches and community groups to run batty events. And whilst not strictly training, but definitely educational, the team produced the Bats in Churches live lunchtime webinar series, which started during the pandemic lockdowns. The recordings of those sessions can be found on the project website or on YouTube. And the training will continue beyond the end of the project to support its legacy. Our Citizen Science Project volunteers have surveyed over 700 churches despite the pandemic. The results from this study are providing a valuable insight into England's bat populations and how we use our churches. Excitingly, this included the discovery of 2 roosts of one of Britain's rarest mammals, the grey long-eared bat, at churches, one in Devon and one in Somerset. Our survey officer is going to tell you more about the wider findings a bit later. Now, being on the steering group for the project has brought with it both ups and downs over the last 5 years. I'm not going to stand up here and tell you that all has been rosy, because like many partnerships, of course it hasn't. A few years ago, we were up against several issues, including difficulty finding match funding and the threat of the partnership coming apart. We've all learnt so much throughout this project, and that challenging period was no exception. But with an amazing project team, a new project manager, and financial commitments from Natural England, we got through that. And as is often the case in life, it made us stronger and more determined. It can safely be said that the partners have an appreciation of each other's perspectives and of the challenges we each face. All of the partners have committed to continuing their working relationship beyond the end of November. I want to read this quote to you from Ben Jenkinson, a church volunteer in Yorkshire, as I think it sums up the ethos of what the project has tried to achieve. It was the bats that brought us back together. We now have a group of around 25 villagers who all have a passion for or interest in St. Peter's. And what we all share and have all noticed is how the building and its bat population have brought the village closer together and re-established a community feel. Sadly, Ben isn't with us today, but I want to thank everyone, and I know there's many of you in the room, who've been involved with this incredible project. The paid staff, the volunteers, the church communities, the schools, and so many others. I know I speak on behalf of the whole project team when I say how much we appreciate you all making the time to celebrate with us, to listen, to learn, to share, and to plan for the future. We hope you all have a great day.
Thanks so much, Lisa. That was absolutely marvellous. Now, next up, we're going to hear about some of our capital works. And I must say a big thanks to our project officer, Honor Gay. She has stood in to do this on her own because, unfortunately, Jenny had to pull out yesterday at the very last minute. So, Honor, a very special thank you for stepping up out of your comfort zone to talk about bats. And I will leave you to it. Here we are. Thank you, Honor.
Thank you very much, Kate, and hello, everybody. I realise I'm starting in the same way as Lisa by saying it is my great privilege and pleasure to talk to you about one of the project's most ambitious works, the reopening of the beautiful Cornish church of St Moran, Lamorran. Now, Tom, next slide, please. So, in 10 minutes, I am going to canter through. I'm going to introduce the church. I'm going to talk about the bats very briefly. I'm going to talk about the process that we went through, the mitigation, separating bats and people, which was the aim of what we set out to do. What happened afterwards, the monitoring, how the bats coped with their new accommodation. And then finally, I'm going to reflect on what made Lamorran a success. So, St Moran is a grade 2-star listed church. It's in a beautiful, next slide please, it's in a beautiful flower-filled churchyard in an idyllic position on the creek, on Lamorran Creek in Cornwall. Mostly what you see is Victorian, and like so many of our 16,500 parish churches, it's got a couple of really interesting features. Next slide. It's got a 2-story detached bell tower with greater horseshoe bats roosting in it, built on Norman foundations, one of only 4 in Cornwall. And it's got one of the finest incised slate monuments in the UK, the Vernon Monument, dating from the mid-17th century. Lamorren, like so many parishes, soldiered on. It held a service every month. It cleaned. The church community raised money for their parish share. They tried to maintain the church. But very sadly, in autumn 2014, the church unofficially closed. And this was partly, but not only, because of a very rich presence of bats in the church, including a roost of brown long-eared bats. Next slide, please. And here you see the impact of what happens when a community is not able to clean anymore. Next slide, please. This is the cleaning burden. Next slide. And this is some of the impact on the heritage on the lectern. So on my second day in the job, and you've heard from Lisa how complicated this project is, Nick Jeans, who's here, I'm delighted to say, phoned me up. I had no idea what I was doing, but basically that was the start of a beautiful relationship over the next couple of years where we, our project, the church architect Robert Shaw, who's also here, the ecologist Jenny, who, as you've heard, is not here, sadly, we all worked together to reopen the church. Next slide, please. So the first thing we did was commission a bat management plan. And here, Jenny and Robert worked together to look at how those particular bats were using that particular church. We needed Jenny's ecological expertise, and we needed Robert's expertise on the church structure. And here you see the problem we were up against. You can see the roosts, and you can see the entrance points as well. Next slide, please. So in terms of the mitigation, the bat management plan was the first stage, but it really is an arduous and resource and emotion intensive process to just get the permissions, to do the administrations to start a mitigation project. So once the bat management plan was agreed by the PCC, the architect, the ecologist, the project, we needed to get faculty. This is, you might call, the ecclesiastical planning process, and it consists of submitting a proposal to Truro Diocesan Advisory Committee, getting advice from experts, and then the Diocesan Chancellor signs this off or proves it. That can be quite a long process. Once that's done, there's also getting a bat license from Natural England. And if you add to that, that this projects like this are highly time sensitive because of bat roosting periods, you really need a long lead-in time. Next slide, please. So the proposal, the original proposal, was to seal the nice Victorian ceiling, nice, not super important, from the interior using a material called glass rock, reversible, and this would have kept bats out of the nave, the church interior, without them losing their roost space, which was in the transepts. But unfortunately, the historic advice we received didn't think this was suitable for the Victorian ceiling. And so you can see here, we went down another route very creatively from Robert to access from the outside, take the tiles off and seal from the inside. Much more difficult and costly process. And there you see Jenny. Next slide, please. And you can see there some of the ceiling from the outside. Next slide, please. And here you can see the original roof and then the void. Very smart, very nice. Next slide, please. And this is the interior. Nice new home for the bats. Very fortunate that there was enough space for the brown long-eareds to be able to roost in the way they needed to. And there you can also see the bat access slate. Next slide, please. So, unfortunately, it didn't work. The nave was too porous to seal the bats out, so after all this, the church was still getting bats. And so, we had to apply for another faculty to do the original glass rocking from the interior. And although the advice we got was still not very happy with it, the Diocesan Chancellor signed this off, and here you can see the interior of the ceiling being sealed. And this extended the project by another year. Next slide, please. Alongside this, I mentioned that bats were not the only issue in terms of Lamoran's closure. But alongside this, the church had a maintenance backlog, and Nick and his colleagues on the PCC did an absolutely Herculean task of raising around £90,000 to repair the woodwork, The furniture was all taken out and cleaned and conserved. There was new lighting. The floors were done. It was a really big task for a very small community. And here you see the interior with part of the works that were really not to do with the bat mitigation. Next slide, please. I've forgotten a little bit. I need to tell you that also, not only did the mitigation not work at first, but once it did work and the bats were excluded from the interior, we lost the bats for a couple of years. So Jenny was monitoring, and the bats were not using their new roost. So this was a success for people, and it was a success for heritage, but it was not a success for bats. But I'm delighted to be able to stand here and say that this year, the third year of monitoring, the bats are using their new home in the South Transept. And this is a big lesson that sometimes it takes a couple of years for the mitigation to work. So I have reflected a lot about Lamoran. It is one of the most rewarding projects that I've been involved in. And I want to distill 4 factors that have made this a success. The first one, Nick, you're going to blush, but it was a champion. So really, I think when churches come back from the brink, it's very often one person who has the drive, the time, the skills to put into raising the money, supervising the works, just really devoting a lot of time to it. So well done, and thank you, Nick. I haven't forgotten that phone call on my second day when I was thinking, what am I doing? The next one was expertise. So Jenny and Robert are superb professionals. Jenny is not only an empathetic and skilled ecologist, able to appreciate other points of view, but the way that she won the contractors' trust was really awe-inspiring. Robert is a super expert on Victorian buildings, was really amazingly flexible about finding another way of achieving the mitigation. It was an absolute pleasure to work with both. Next, please. So, of course, the role of the project was not insignificant. I think not only did we provide the funding for the bat mitigation, which was around, I think, in total, the bat phase was about £100,000. Nick had to raise about another £90,000. This was, not insignificant. But I think it also helped to have someone relatively neutral, appreciative of all 3 perspectives, drawing the team together. And finally, I think it was the team we became. We all cared passionately about different aspects of this project, and we listened to each other, we learnt from each other, and I think that the fact that we gelled as a good team was one of the most important factors in making this a success. Thank you very much. The slide's gone red. I think I'm in time.
Thank you so much, Honor. It was wonderful. So next we are going to hear from another Bats and Churches Engagement Officer. It is the wonderful Diana Spencer. And a special thank you to Diana for how much she's helped out with this event today. You've really been marvellous. But Diana is actually going to be talking about Saxlingham, one of our churches in Norfolk. Unfortunately, we couldn't get someone from Saxlingham to come today, but Diana is going to speak on their behalf. So Diana, away you go.
Yes, this is the bit where I get to come on stage and stay on stage instead of dashing on, setting a timer and dashing off before someone speaks. So yeah, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about St Margaret's in Saxlingham, which is one of our project churches in Norfolk. And it's up there, just right off the North Norfolk coast near Holt. And talking of things that happened to us on our first site visit, turns out there's another St Margaret's in Saxlingham in Norfolk, about 60 miles away from this one. And it's really important to double check the postcode on your sat-nav before you drive out, because that was an interesting journey. But yeah, so it's a beautiful church. It's a Grade 2 listed building. Sorry, I'm going to have to ask you to move that on there as well. We're all having clicker trouble today, I'm afraid. It's not one of our most historic interiors compared to some of the churches we're working with. It was a very, very major Victorian restoration. But it is still a lovely church. It's got some beautiful wall monuments, ledger stones, a nice font. It also has, there we go. Previously had an enormous Egyptian-style monument, a funerary monument to this lady, Lady Mirabel Hayden. And while the main monument has gone from the centre of the church, there's still a lot of this lovely alabaster statuary around the church as well. And even though we say potentially not the most highest heritage value of some of our churches, it had a really good, really engaged community who really, really cared about the building. And also, you know, it's in a nice location, it's potentially on tourist trails, so it had a huge amount of potential as a building for people and as a community space as well. Now, unfortunately, the church shared its home with a huge number of these little beasties. This is a natterer's bat. And these are one of the bats that we find are particularly common in churches in Norfolk in much larger numbers than you would necessarily find in churches elsewhere in the country. And if you can, thank you. You could press play on that, that should do. This is some video taken inside the church, hopefully. Can you click that again? There we go. So this very significant number of natterer's bats were spending a huge amount of time in the interior of the church, quite a large portion of the night. And that meant that the church was really one of the most heavily damaged. Thank you. One of the most heavily affected churches that we worked with in Norfolk. It was completely covered in plastic. And I'm told that if you were in there at night, you could literally hear the urine pitter-pattering on the plastic as you walked around because of how and I think we described it as sticky, which is one of the least flattering adjectives I think you can apply to a church. So this was on our list for, obviously, very importantly, surveys and to do some mitigation work for them. So this is the bat survey done by Phil Parker, who you'll be hearing from very shortly, and thanks to Phil for his video and photos, which are most of what you're seeing in this as well. And as you can see, the bats were largely coming in and out where those red spots are in the transepts. It's quite a simple church, a nave and a chancel and two big transepts, and it was really the two transepts that the bats were interested in. So that's where we started to look for mitigation. We initially looked at the south side of the church. We know bats generally tend to prefer the south side of the church. It's a little bit warmer, it's a little bit more sheltered, there was nice access to it. Unfortunately, in the south transept here is where they kept their organ. And that made working in that area a little bit difficult. You need quite a big space for a natterer's roost for mitigation. And we would have had to have worked around the organ, tried to get behind it, and it really affected the amount of ceiling clearance we would have had. So we looked over at the north transept. Is it going? There we go. And so the north transept was largely being used as a vestry. It already had this screen that went about 3/4 of the way up. And that section there in the top half looked absolutely perfect for putting in a bat loft. So that's what we did. So we started, first of all, by putting some roosting features actually up in the rafters as well, making it a much more appealing space for the bats. And then the next stage was to start separating that loft off from the rest of the church. So that was where we put this ceiling in across the top of the vestry. The vestry's still lit by the bottom half of the window. They've still got that as a really clean, usable space. And then above the ceiling is where we started to give the room for the bat loft. So this is it working through from the first year. I love that view, it's such an unusual view of the church being high up and looking down. And then obviously the next stage was to close that off. And so that was done by putting in a screen with a door across it. This was done in the first year. We leave it there for a year or two to allow the bats to settle, to get used to the space, to fly in and out, and get used to all the new roosting space. And then we could start blocking them off from all the other entry points to the church. And this is the workers up there on scaffolding and ladders. They also here used a drone to fly up to the eaves levels to be able to survey to see where the gaps were, which was really, really handy. And while they were up there, you can see they also cleaned a huge amount of mess off the walls as well to give the church a really good high-level clean. And then it didn't look very impressive in the first section, but once the screen was settled in and working, we gave it this lovely kind of carved, stained cladding that effectively matches the cladding that was there already. The door is there so that people can get access to the bat loft, can check it, can clean it. We can access the cameras, the data loggers, and everything else that is in there. And that's what it looks like from the outside. So as you can see, even though we've done a really sizable piece of work there, if you came in and visited this church, not really having been there before, this just looks like it's always been a part of the church and really fits in. And certainly this was working. We've had a couple of little niggles with it. Unfortunately, some of the wood in the door warped slightly when we had those really, really hot days a couple of years ago, which obviously meant a little bit of a gap. So that needed fixing. And it'll be a theme you'll hear with all the case studies that you can read about and hear today, is that there's always little tweaks and changes as you go along. So a little bit with the door. We're also looking to actually put a little bit of ventilation in it, because at the moment it's almost airtight, so there is a bit of a smell building up in it. So we're just going to try and put a little bit of ventilation to get some fresh air through it as well. But certainly the first year that's been there, the bats have taken to it. They really like the space. And certainly the first year or so, it's been incredibly successful in the church. We've got a little bit more blocking work to do this year, we know, so that we can hopefully have the church bat-free. And Phil's continuing to monitor that over the next few years. But we're delighted to say, as of this summer, the church was open and clean. And we had a lovely bat night event in there that was really, really well attended. Something the community had never been able to do before. They would never have been able to host this kind of event in the church in the summer. So it's really, really opened it up for them. And they also had our lovely artwork as well. And again, this is something we would never have been able to leave in the church for 3 weeks in the summer without it being incredibly messed up. So it gives you an idea of not only can you do quite big works that can be quite successful, we have to thank Ian Walker, the architects, for helping design this as well. It's amazing how much some of these really, really significant works can actually be really discreet and really fit into the life of the church. So it's not a case of doing something big and ugly. It really be sympathetic to the church. If you do want any more details on what we've done here and how it's been working, please do speak to myself or Phil, or the case studies are there at the back as well. Very quick rush through one of our case studies, but I hope that's given you a bit of an idea of the thought processes that go behind some of these big mitigation works. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Diana. And next we are going to hear from project ecologist Chris Demant. And Chris, I believe you are going to be telling us all about Redstone.
Yes. Can I just slide? Oh.
Down, that's next slide.
Okay. Hopefully I'll get this right. Hopefully I'll get this right. Can you hear me all right? Measuring success. I'm going to give you an ecologist perspective on this. In 2017, DEFRA issued an invitation to tender for the Batson Churches project. And it stated we had to work closely with each of the church communities to gather ecological and social information and help facilitate the planning and implementation of approaches in solving the conflict between Batson people at the most impacted churches. Can you not? Sorry. The work would involve significant time on the site. Sorry.
Hold on a second. Is that the right way round? Have we made our first mistake? Oh, I think the slides are the wrong way round. I'm so sorry.
Phil, I need to hand over to you, I think.
I think we're just going to swap. Let's just swap.
Yeah.
There we go.
Or shall I talk about this?
You could talk about Thornham if you like. There we go.
Reset the timer for him.
Yeah, come on. Thank you.
Sorry about that.
Okay, so which way was this?
There was always going to be something, wasn't there? Yeah.
Oh, I'm down to 15 minutes, right. Okay, so I'm not Chris, obviously, I'm Phil Parker. I've got quickly 2 churches to talk about. One is, they're both Grade 1 listed churches. This is All Saints Thornham, 15th century church on the Norfolk coast, a magnificent church. We've known for at least 10 years there's been a large bat population at the church. Soprano pipistrelles, so one of our commonest bats, and they were roosting largely in mortise joints in the nave and under the purlins on the south side of the nave. Oops. And their access point largely was through the northwest clerestory window, through a missing window pane. And this is just a quick video showing up to 250 bats emerging out of the window every evening. Quite spectacular. And then there was another access point for the bats on the southwest corner of the south aisle. So over the course of the survey period, 2019 to 2021, we recorded well over 200 to 250 soprano pipistrelles each time. But the peak counts always tended to be early in the breeding season, so it was thought that there may be a link roost somewhere else in the locality. It's something that often happens with soprano pipistrelles. And this just shows you the sort of the counts we were getting. So what impact were the bats having on the church? As Diana showed at Saxlingham, the organ pipes were getting damaged. Heavy deposition of droppings on the carpet and on the pews. This is a church that is, unlike most Norfolk churches, has a service every week. So every week they're having to clean up the plastic, take it outside, shake it, remove the droppings. And even more significant damage, urine damage to ledger stones. And then it's got a magnificent medieval rood screen which was been damaged by the droppings and the urine. But the general feeling about the church, no matter how much cleaning you did, it always looked dirty. Any white surfaces that were on the ground were just covered with urine. So what management work did we do to try and help the church? The first thing we did was to put a bat box over the window where they were exiting. This is the northwest clerestory window. And the original intention had been to put the box on the inside, but dealing with the architect, it was felt that the cost of maintenance in terms of having to have scaffolding, because it's a very tall church, every time you needed to get to the box would be prohibitive. So we ended up putting it on the outside. Now, being on the north side of the church, it's obviously not benefiting from any solar heat from the sun, so this box had to be heated. So if you look at the picture second down on the left, that cavity at the bottom of the box is where the tubular heater went. So it created a hot box, and then the heat rises up into the roosting areas. If you look middle right, that is looking through the access into the box, and that sort of diamond shape you can see is the window that the bats emerge from. So the bats are emerging from the window, through the box, and then to the outside. And it was decided to give the bats the best chance of being able to find and use the box was to keep the access open to the church for the first season. In the south aisle, to give options for the bats, we put in some rafter boxes. So these are battens attached to the underside of the roof with boards, and then they would be stained to match the rest of the boards. And again, in the first season, these were left open so the bats could come through past the boxes, hopefully start to investigate them, and then they could be closed up after the first year. And then we also put some multi-chambered boxes on the outside, on the south side, on the chancel and the south aisle. The whole idea was to give the bats the maximum opportunity to find different roosts. And one thing we've done extensively is use technology to be able to help us to monitor. So here you're looking at cameras that are installed in the heated box. Top left is looking at the exit into the church, top right looking at the exit out. And they're all set by motion sensors, so those little yellow bars are telling us every time the camera's been triggered. So it's easy for us to go back and actually check how many bats have been going out at any time. And that's just some of the bats in the entrance to the box. To put in this heated box, we had to have an electrician to put in the heating cables and the cables for the cameras. And it's quite a long, tortuous route for the cables. And they're all managed by sensors. And what we didn't want with these thermostats is if they broke, having to take all the cables off the walls again. So we worked with the people that made these Habestat, and they've now got 30-meter detachable sensors on them. So if anything goes wrong, it's easy for us to fix. And they barely charged us anything for doing it, so they wanted to work with the project, which was great. And they also allow us to sort of monitor the temperatures and humidity over a period of time. And also in the church, we've got a static detector that is kept in there permanently, and we can go and check it as we want to see what bats have been using. Issues with the cameras, bats sitting right in front of the camera, so I can't see anything coming past it. And also we tend to get spiders triggering the cameras. They can be changed on the sensitivity, but it's a work in progress. The church has always had very, very active community bat nights. Our record attendance on a bat night at Thornham was 155 people. And that gives you a lot of scope for raising money. Obviously, the heated boxes take money to run, so having these engagement events can help raise money to do that. And we've got posters up in the church. So what's the progress so far? Favourable conservation status for the 3 least common species in the church has been maintained. Initially, in the first year, the soprano pipistrelle roost didn't return. Even though they could get into the church, they didn't come back. This year, numbers have started to increase, and we've started in the last few weeks to see more and more bats using the heated boxes. It just goes to show how long these projects can take. Bats can take time to actually get used to what you put in. So our next steps, the PCC have agreed to keep the box open for another year to give the bats the best chance of finding the heated box. We've got wiring into the cafe area, which is in the south aisle, and we're going to have a TV screen, so now people can actually watch the bats in the boxes while they're having their coffee. And we're going to be putting the church in the National Bat Monitoring Programme. The second church, quickly, is this one, St Mary's at Gayton Thorpe. This is in the middle, near King's Lynn, 11th century round tower church, my favourite church in the whole world. Sorry. Okay. I've been told I can have a bit longer. Like with Thornham, we've been involved with Gayton Thorpe since 2013 when they were doing roof works. And at that time, there was a large common pipistrelle roost in the church, roosting above one of the beams, and they were exiting via the southwest corner of the nave. It's a very simple church, round tower, nave, and chancel. And they were exiting through the southwest corner of the nave. So when we undertook the repair works, we took the opportunity to actually build in some additional bat roosting features into the church, with the hope ultimately that we could encourage the bats to move to the outside. And one of these was a bat box that's in the eaves just behind that yellow circle on the wall. And the other one was we took some mortar out from one of the slates up on the roof to give bats access between the slates and the underfelt. And monitoring during the initial project period, we had a roost of, peak roost of 508 soprano pipistrelles, and they were actually using the bat box that we put in for the common pipistrelles originally. So the soprano pipistrelles are coming out of the yellow circle, and the common pipistrelles are roosting under the ridge in the purple circle. And we had up to 104 common pipistrelles. So that makes it the church in Norfolk that has got the largest number of bats, which is, the church actually were quite proud of that. And going at night and watching the bats emerge, or if you get up early in the morning, you can see them go back. It's quite spectacular, and you can actually, if you sit there, hear the wings of the bats flapping over your head as you go. It's quite wonderful. So what management works have we done at this church? So the first thing was we went and cleared all the droppings out off the wall tops because it had never been cleaned. There was quite a smell in there. We did take quite a few bin bags of bat droppings out. I'll hasten to add they all went on the church warden's garden as the really good fertiliser. And then we built a multi-chambered bat box, and the idea was this would sit on the wall top behind the point where the bats got into the church and obstruct their access in. And that's the box having been placed. Again, this has got cameras. It doesn't need to be heated because it's on the south side of the church. And then, as we do with a lot of churches, we took the opportunity to put some bat boxes up in the churchyard. Whilst they're not going to encourage the large maternity roosts necessarily to adopt them, again, it's all good for biodiversity and enhancement. Once we'd blocked off the access into the church, it all seemed to be working well, so the large numbers that were getting into the church had largely reduced. But we did find there were bats still getting in, and through leaving cameras in overnight, we were able to identify their access points. So earlier this year, we put some scaffolding up at the end of the church and blocked off all the points that we'd identified where they'd accessed. And then we put a camera in to see how effective that had been over the summer, hoping we wouldn't find any bats at all. And that was what had happened. So basically, the bats had sort of found a different route in, and even more than we'd had before. So not entirely successful. In terms of the counts at the church, this year we had our record number of common pipistrelles. They're the species that don't get into the church at all, 130. And the adult numbers of soprano pipistrelles have been fairly constant. What we did find last year, particularly, the roost left the church very early in July when we had those exceptionally hot temperatures. I think it just got too hot for them. And as like with Thornham, they probably will have another roost they can use somewhere nearby where the conditions are more acceptable. So messages. The common pipistrelles took 3 years, this was from 2013, to take to their new access points at the church. The soprano pipistrelles did the same, but in putting that mitigation in at the time the roof works were done, basically there was no cost to it apart from just the cost of building a box because the scaffolding was there, the tiles were off. So it's a good time to look at installing mitigation is when works have been undertaken. And unfortunately this year, the exclusion works have had sort of a negative effect, so we've now got to decide what we do, how we deal with that, and stop bats getting trapped. The church is in the National Bat Monitoring Programme, so we'll continue to do that every year, and this is a good way of monitoring populations. And we're going to continue to do our regular bat nights and engage with the locals. and also engage the locals in helping with the monitoring. Because once the project finishes, we still need to monitor these populations. And as you can see, dogs are very good at counting bats. It's such an engaging thing, getting all the local community out. When we've had bat nights there, we've had a barbecue in the churchyard, and it just becomes a big community event. And we'll continue to do that. And that's it.
Where was I? An ecologist take on some of it, from the point of view of the tender requested that we look at working with communities, and before we even put a bid in, I went to St Lawrence Church. No, I'm going the wrong way. Apologies. We went to the church, and I have to admit, in the top right corner, you'll see the state of the church. It was smelly, dark, damp. It was closed to the public. There were no services taking place there anymore. And I had my doubts that we could actually solve the problem here, even before we put the tender in. It was in a very bad state. As with restoring any historic building, the first challenge is to to identify the significance of the church, and that could include its historic fabric, the community values for it, and getting behind, if you like, the nitty-gritty, getting under the surface of what was important about it and the sense of place. What's more, by doing this, you enable others to join in with you. The process was very much working with people to understand what was important, working with the architects. During the surveys, we quickly established that we were dealing with a nationally significant population of bats. We weren't quite sure how important that was, but we had a peak count of 250 natterers used in the building. And I have to admit, sitting there at night, at dusk or at dawn, watching 250 bats fly around inside a church, the noise, the activity, I think it's a spectacle that should be on a David Attenborough documentary, to be quite honest. It's a brilliant spectacle of wildlife. The next challenge for us was how we built a team. The church community there is actually quite small. It serves a small, dispersed little village. It's got a lot of challenges in the local area, and the church wasn't actually being used anymore. It was facing being deconsecrated. So we set about listening to the people, the community there, and the architect and their values, before we could actually come up with ideas and try and find solutions to what would it take to restore church services again and make the church part of the community. We also had to work with government agencies and DAC faculty consents. I have to be honest, when we talk about knowledge and understanding, the biggest understanding was from each party understanding the other. Architects have their own terms, ecologists have their own terms, and the DAC process has a completely different system that I'm used to working in planning terms. And it's quite, I would say, archaic, but it belongs in the medieval period, I think, sometimes. And trying to work your way around it. And also, just trying to understand each other. We were all coming from slightly different directions. The next step for me was to actually start beginning to gather evidence and find out what solutions we could come up with. And I met up with a friend of mine, Henry Schofield at the Vincent Wildlife Trust. He mentioned there's a church they'd been working on in the 90s in Wales called Llangefni Church. And there they'd taken a quite unique approach to working with a large population of lesser horseshoes. And they actually built a false ceiling into the church. And they didn't need listed building consent. They didn't need faculty because they actually designed it to sit on top of the walls. It didn't interfere with the fabric of the church. And they built a complete new ceiling. And that's still going today. I actually spent a day up there opening up the church when they put it back for people to use it from when it's been in the bats. So it made me start thinking about how bats use the churches, how we use the churches in both time and space, and how you could section off areas both in time as well as space. And we came up with one idea, which was to actually use a sail. to try and divide that space up. But it was just another way of trying to think about things. That idea, unfortunately, didn't go ahead, but we also began to look at other spaces within the church. We asked the church which bits they didn't use, and it quickly transpired the church tower was redundant, the building structure wasn't particularly good, and we knew the bats had been in the tower, so we actually looked at some simple fixes in that we could implement quite quickly. Shuttering off the bell windows so that it reduced the draft, it also reduced the light, and we could actually enhance the structure to be at varied temperatures from the roof tiles down to the base of it. And that was a really simple and effective mitigation measure we thought we could implement. And it's one I think we could look at using in a lot more churches where the tower isn't being used. Excuse me. So we actually came up with a menu of selection of ideas that the church could actually adopt or the team could think about. And we worked with the team, which included Adrian, I think the architect who's here today, to look at those solutions, the simple of which was clean the church. That's something we did. That was quite a nice, simple solution. Make it valuable to people again, and at least make it look and appear nice. Sorry, the slides are not moving on. We looked at boxing in the eaves, which is a standard method that's been used. I think you've heard about it, some of it from Phil. We set up looking at alternative bat access points to the church, and we thought about enhancing the bell tower, as we've already said. We thought about seasonally separating the church through a sail, and in discussing that with Adrian, we quickly came up with the alternative idea, which was actually build a separate space for the bats above the chancel roof, the ceiling rather. And there was a scissor-braced framework, timber framework within that, so we came up with putting a new ceiling in and separating the space out between people and nature. That was probably one of the most expensive solutions we came up with, and of course that's the one they chose to go with, along with the bell tower. And who could blame them, to be quite honest? The church was in a real state. So we worked with Adrian to come up with some designs. Here's some thumbnail sketches, what it might look like and what it eventually did look like. And Adrian worked wonders with his design, which actually embraced the scissor-braced ceiling. You could still see the outline of it, how it appeared. And he prepared his detailed drawings. We managed to incorporate eaves boxes into the design as well as the roof, and it embraced where the bats had access to the chancel, they could then fly up and through it. And so, with the final designs approved, and we got through to faculty and protected species licensing, it was all steam ahead, but what could go wrong? A global pandemic, and that's put us behind. It's put most of the projects, I think, have been behind. We actually started one the week before they actually closed closed life down for 6 months. So, with the easing of restrictions, we had a great team of craftsmen who were able to help us carry out the work, but with a year behind, we had to start thinking about the process for excluding the bats. And we actually left the ceiling open so the bats could fly in through where they're used to going in and fly into the church and enjoy the church for a year before we then fully closed it down. In that time, they could also go into the roof void and use that space. So they got used to using both spaces. Well, that was the hope. That was the hope. Sorry. And that's how it looked before we did the work. And that's how we looked after we finished it. And I think from a dark, smelly church to a bright, light space, I think it's made a huge change, that church, in a positive direction. Excuse me. So the first year, the bats were able to use the ordinary space across the whole church, and then they were restricted to just the roof above the chancel as well as the roof void. In the first year, when we did the exclusion, the bats were seen crawling up the space and actually using the roof void. And I think as ecologists, we went away really happy. Boy, did we fall foul the following year. Came down to earth with a bang. There were no bats using the church roof void at all. We were fortunate that we had about 50% of the population using the church tower. We then had to set about thinking about where had the other 50% gone, what had happened to them. And we were required under the license to carry out radio tracking to identify that if we had had a major impact on the population, which clearly we had. I just want to talk about some spin-offs from the project. We worked with Sussex University and the Mammal Society to come up with a bat count app, which allowed people doing bat surveys to use their roost count data and compare it against a standard set of monitoring data collected by the Bat Conservation Trust for their National Bat Monitoring Programme. And we developed this app, and you could actually put into it where your church sat, your number, and identify in the top graph where it sat as a church building or a house, and you could also identify where it sat in terms of the time of year you did it. So in this case, I don't know if you can see the right dot quite near the top. In most cases, you had a moderate exception, a moderate or good population. Our population of natterers at Radstone sat well outside the outliers and the exceptional at 250. So it's clearly a nationally significant population. So that was one spin-off. We also worked on Bats in the Landscape project, where we looked at trying to qualify natterers populations in each of the churches, and we worked on 35 and 52 churches to look at landscape modelling, to look at why bats were used in churches particularly. And unfortunately, the outcome of that is there is no reason why, at the broad scale, we can find out at the present moment. The landscape details are just not there available and statistically to evaluate it. We spent a lot of time on that and produced nothing, but it was a very interesting exercise. There is a small relationship between arable farming. The dominance of arable farming does reduce the likelihood of bats being in churches. That's counter what we expected, but that's probably because in dominant arable landscapes there are less bats anyway. So that was one spin-off. And then came the idea of trying to find out where the rest of the population were. Now, we were unlucky enough to have HS2 in our area. The church about 500 metres from HS2 railway line. And in previous years, they'd been carrying out radio tracking studies at the church and on natterers populations. And they established a number of colonies in the area, both using the church and using woodlands towards the northwest, and using woodlands towards the east. And we used that as the basis for our radio tracking 2 years ago, and we radio tracked 4 bats from the church, 2 of which kindly stayed in the church and the church tower, and the other 2 sped off to the northwest in a new area of woodland that hadn't been previously recorded with the natterers population. So that was the first year, and we sort of began to think that maybe, because the population was so low, that they had split into 2 different colonies. So we set about, in the next year, looking at those colonies, and we radio tracked we caught bats both at the church and in the woodland. We caught 4 in the church, and they stayed in the church completely throughout that period, foraging at night in the local area. And the ones we caught in the woodland stayed in the woodland. And interesting enough, they stayed very close to the trees they'd been in previous years. And so we were able to conclude that they're not using the same woodland as the HS2 bats, they're used in a completely different area. And we hope, and we think, that the population's actually broken into 2 and split between the church and the wider landscape. Which is a good positive story, I think, to come out of that. They can adapt to change, they can adapt. The populations are probably not as high as they were. When we did the pre-intervention surveys, we had about 250 natterers post-maternity. Now we're getting population cumulatively in the woodland and the church about 150. But we've got 2 separate populations within landscape, which are possibly more stable. And there may be more, and we may just have missed a few more that have set about. The important thing to remember at natterers, particularly in woodlands, they're fission fusion species. They come apart and come together. They may use 3 different bat roosts on the same night, and then change roosts the next day. So it's quite difficult to actually radio track and identify that without spending a lot of time. This was done over 1 week. Any further would have cost even more money. Just hopefully this will play. This is top left. Can you play all the 3 videos? The top left is pre-intervention. The bottom right is playing, the left isn't. The bottom left isn't playing yet. All right, that's beginning to play. So the top left is pre-doing the works. There's bats flying into their roost in a beam. The bottom left is in the church tower this year. And the bottom right is a nursery colony of bats coming out, including juveniles learning to fly for the first time. Now, I mean, the spectacle of seeing the bats inside the church before we did the intervention, it was heartbreaking to remove those bats from inside that church from an ecologist's point of view. But now we can see them using the church tower and the woodland. I'm actually far happier with it. I still have reservations. I'm an ecologist. But in seeing those numbers, I would ask you to judge whether in this instance we'd actually achieve favourable conservation status. The church community are absolutely delighted with the work. We still have a few bats getting into the church, we still have a few droppings, but by and large, they have their church back. Not only do they have their church back, we had a Christmas service there the first year after the intervention was carried out for the first time. We had a dedication service, and now services are held regularly there. And in fact, Penny, who is the church warden, the champion behind this particular scheme, her daughter got married there this September, and which is a great story behind it. So from that point of view, when we look at measuring success, I would ask you to think about whether that has achieved success or not. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Chris. That's wonderful. So up next, we have got Mark Sproat from Churches Conservation Trust, who is going to talk to us about a beautiful little church in North Yorkshire. Thank you, Mark.
Yeah, well, first of all, I'd just like to thank Batson Churches for inviting us to speak here. I've worked for the Churches Conservation Trust for 2 years, and this story is by far the kind of the best story I've got to tell about churches. I think I probably need to apologise. I'm not going to talk about bats very much. This story very much focuses on the people and the people of the village and around the church. So yeah, so this is our the CCT strategy map. You can see we have 3 main threads there, and the story of the bats at Wintringham very much fit into that middle strand there about supporting communities and how they can love their places of worship again. So to set the scene, when I arrived at the Churches Conservation Trust, St Peter's at Wintringham was looked after by 2 people. Phyllis, who's in the picture there, and Ben, who Lisa mentioned earlier. That's not Ben there, that's just for representational purposes only. The church was well looked after. You know, kind of Phyllis and Ben had done a sterling job of keeping the church as clean and as usable as they possibly could, but there wasn't really very much happening around the church or in the church. You can see their representation, you know, they kind of did what they could at Christmas, but what you can see is very much missing there is there's no people in the church. And that's obviously the aim of the strategy was to change that. So I was contacted by Batson Churches to explain that they wanted to do a bat count at the church, and I felt this was a great opportunity to engage the wider community and try and get some interest back in the church. Once we knew the date, Ben and I, who canvassed the whole village, there's around 73 properties in the village, population of 200 people, 201 I think actually, and we basically put a small leaflet through every door in the village inviting them to this first bat count. And turnout was good. I stood there myself, you know, kind of 11 o'clock at night in a churchyard in the middle of North Yorkshire, just crossing my fingers that some people would turn up. And I think we probably got about 14 or 15 people there on that first night. And you can see, obviously, there's some photographs of the people getting involved. Oh. And it was good to see some kids turn out as well. the lady there with the blonde hairs, Jane, her daughter was really excited by the bats and really kind of engaged in it. Not quite enough to be a champion at our school. I think she was slightly embarrassed. She didn't want to tell everybody at school she was into bats, but secretly she loved them. And since that day, the community and the church itself has gone from strength to strength. I think that year there was another 3 or 4 bat counts. I didn't attend them. It's kind of a bit far from home to be kind of standing in a churchyard at midnight. And there was one in the morning as well. And I think each of them had at least the same amount of people, but it wasn't the same people each time. And as a result, now the church is looked after by a group of around 30 people. And in a village of 200 rather, that's a significant part of the village who are kind of engaged in and care for the church. I mean, they love the bats, but like I say, my focus is the church. But there you go. Most importantly, you can see that there are people in the church again. The church is being used. There was just a harvest festival last week. That was attended by a good proportion of the village. I think they're regularly getting 50 or 60 people in the church for services and activities. Yeah, so, and they've also sustained the momentum. That first bat count was last year, and it had those photographs there had kind of, was supposed to fan out in me presentation, but you can see they make a bit of a social event of the bat counts this year with pizzas and takeaways being ordered, and kind of they really have fun with the bat count and with the church generally. The second set of photos are photos of what I feel a little bit embarrassed. We called it the North Yorkshire Summer of Culture, which sounds very grand and very exciting, but it was 6 churches across North Yorkshire, had 3 different performers, 1 choir, 1 storyteller, and a few poets over the summer, and really re-engaged the communities in the space, but not around religious services. It was a way to demonstrate to communities that the spaces can be used for things other than religious service, and because of the success of the bats at Wintringham, each of those activities was really well attended. The choir, for example, I think there was 100 people in the church to watch the choir, and they're very keen to have the choir back again. I think this is a particularly strong representation, I guess, of how successful the bats have been in getting the community to re-engage with the church. Phyllis felt so secure that this new team were in place and were able to look after the church that she's retired. Retired from looking after the church, but still an active member of the Friends, still a prominent member of the community, and always present at community and services, community events and services in the church. But yeah, I think it's testament to how successful the new group have been that she's felt able to step back. That's her, obviously. Yeah, so I've got you some time back. So thank you. Thanks.
That was absolutely wonderful, Mark. Thank you so much for telling that story in such a lovely way. Brilliant. The next segment that we've got is pre-recorded. Jean from Compton Martin PCC couldn't be here today, but she did record this herself and sent it in for us to listen to. So I think, Dana, are you doing something technical? We're going to hear from Jean from Compton Martin anyway, and it's an absolutely lovely story, so please enjoy this. And next we're going to hear from Claire Boothby from BCT, who is of course a valued part of our core delivery team. So Claire is going to talk to us today about our citizen science programme. Thank you, Claire.
Fantastic. Hi, everyone. Okay. Is this one? Fantastic. So I think I've spoke to a few of you before we started, and we all said, I cannot believe that we're nearly at an end with the Batson Churches project. It was 4.5 years ago that I started working on Batson Churches with that daunting but fantastic task of organising a nationwide citizen science survey and organising and developing the training offer for the programme. And it's been brilliant to work with some fantastic people, my lovely colleagues from Batson Churches, some very skilled and knowledgeable consultants, but also some really dedicated volunteers. And included in that is the 387 volunteers that took part in our surveys. And some of you are here today. I just want to say a great big thank you for that. So I'm going to be talking a bit more about our volunteer surveys. So our volunteers spanned a wealth of experience. On one hand, we had people that were experienced bat surveyors, sometimes even ecological consultants that have sometimes worked with churches, but not always. On the other hand, we had church wardens and incumbents that were really interested to learn more about bats and bat surveying. So during this, we put on lots of training sessions. Some of those training sessions were about bat survey techniques. Some of it was about how to work best with church communities. So the findings have, of course, been valuable, and I'm going to talk a bit about that. But I just wanted to highlight that there have been some additional benefits as well, and that sometimes the conversations went past our church visits and our questionnaires. That in several cases, I have given resources to volunteers to lead bat walks, to lead bat talks in churches. And I will actually say that, the lovely artwork that we've heard a lot about this morning from Phil and Eileen, that they started off with the Batson Churches project as part of these surveys as well. Sorry, I do need my notes. I've got numbers, and I can't remember numbers. But so our targets with these surveys were was to really extend the project's reach from the core project churches, which you've heard about this morning, of which there are about 100. So our target was to reach at least 700 churches across England. We wanted to better understand bat occupancy, so how many churches house bats. We wanted to understand perspectives around bats in churches across England. And we wanted this to help inform the advice that was given by our partners, and also to help inform future support and engagement as well. So our volunteers, equipped with a clipboard, a pen and survey forms, visited a huge 753 churches. And that is, considering that we had the pandemic, etc., within this time, I think we did a really good job. And as you can see, the distribution of those churches was far and wide. On this map, the ones in orange are the churches where we did find evidence of bats, and the red is where we didn't, and both have been extremely important. So our surveys were one-off visits to a church where we looked for evidence of bats. So we were scoping churches to see if we could find bat droppings and bat urine. And we also carried out a questionnaire with somebody from the church. Some people also did a bit of a more detailed survey, and they took a bat detector into the church to record the ultrasonic calls of the bats. And we also asked people to collect bat droppings for DNA analysis. So we were being sent in lots of bat droppings by post. So thank you very much to BCT, who didn't mind having bat droppings in the fridge in the office for quite some time during the summer. So I'm just going to go into, we've got a short amount of time, but I wanted to go into some of the findings. I will ask that you please don't share this on social media at the moment, because we are writing up this work for peer review, because we feel that this will make it really accessible and easy to find, not just for people that want to do some research in England and want to learn more, but actually on an international scale as well. It'll be easier to reference, and we do hope as well that because it's peer reviewed, that the information really will be trusted. Okay, so the findings then, importantly. So we have found that about half of the C of E churches in England house bats, more specifically between 45 and 55%. And if we convert that into the number of churches, that's about 9,000 churches in England. And our surveys really focused on areas of churches that people are using. When you consider that bats can also use external features of churches, they can use voids, this wasn't incorporated into our surveys, so the true figure of churches with bats could be even higher. Okay, so not only do half of our churches house bats, but if they do house bats, they're likely to house multiple species. So we've had several churches with at least 6 bat species, but our median was 3 bat species using a church. Now, when we're thinking about the older churches, you're actually much more likely to find bats using them, and I don't think this comes as a surprise. So actually, when we're looking at the medieval churches, we think that they're going to be found in about 73 to 84% of churches, so 3/4 of our churches, of those older churches, housing bats. What might come as a bit more of a surprise is when we look at the questionnaire information from the churches. So not only was there a lot of positivity towards bats, but actually churches were more likely to be positive if bats were using the church. And sorry, this is quite a small, typing on this bar chart. But the first cluster is where there were no bats, or the church didn't know if there were bats using the church. The second cluster is where bats were known to roost in the church building, and the third where bats were no longer present. And that first bar, the white bar, actually represents the people who were positive or very positive about the bats. And if I zoom in a little bit, at the churches that knew there were bats present, you can see that actually, overwhelmingly, people were positive or very positive about their bats, and very few were negative. And that's really encouraging, considering how many churches house bats. Okay, so we also asked, so where churches did have bats, were the bats affecting worship or other activities in the church? I'm really happy to say that in a vast majority of cases, no. So this looks at worship, but it was very similar for weddings and funerals and Sunday schools, that actually 93% said that there was no disruption. And I will also say here that actually 35% of the churches where we found bat evidence, churches didn't actually know that bats were present. Of course, for the churches where we did find elements of disruption, it is important that we continue to support those churches. And Kate will be speaking a bit later on about the legacy of the project and the resources that we'll have available. So we also asked churches about perceived damage. And I just want to be quite clear here that it wasn't an objective view of church damage, but it was how people felt. Did they feel that there was damage to the church interior? And this is important as well because it did link to people's perceptions on bats. So I'm glad that over half, so 60%, found that there was no damage, or they didn't feel that there was any damage to the church interior. A small percentage, 3.4%, found that they did feel that there was substantial damage. And again, Kate will speak a bit later about all of our heritage cleaning advice that we will have and will be available to support churches going forward. Okay. So, within these surveys, we recorded at least 12 species of bats. And that is a lot, considering we only have 18 species of bats within the UK. And actually, when we only think about the breeding species, it's 17. So these are our 4 most frequently recorded bats in churches. So our common pipistrelle, we predict is in about 35% of our churches. Brown long-eared bat in about 31% of churches, soprano pipistrelle in 18, and serotine in about 11, but they do have more southerly distribution. But with all 4 of these species, we recorded them in sufficient numbers of churches to be able to dig a bit deeper. So what are the factors affecting their use of churches? Now, here is where I'm going to slightly differ from something that Chris mentioned on his work with natterers. But there's 2 factors that I'm really wanting to draw out from those models that we did. And one is about surrounding landscapes to churches. So for all of the species that we were able to model, one of the factors that was particularly important was the surrounding landscape, but particularly the amount of arable land. So with greater percentage of arable land surrounding the church, you are more likely to find bats using that church building. And for brown long-eared bats, our second most frequently recorded species, that was also true of improved grassland or pasture. So in these more agricultural landscapes, it was clear that churches were particularly important for bats. And in these areas, there are often fewer roosting options for them. And it is important to put that in context because that's often where there's lower congregation numbers as well that are trying to keep these churches going. So it's quite important that we bear that in mind when we go forward with engagement. And also it would be very useful to find ways of increasing kind of roosting options in these areas. And I also wanted to highlight some of the work around lighting. So lighting has been found in previous studies to be detrimental to bats in churches. Our study, as far as I'm aware, for the first time, has really shown the importance of aspect of the lighting. So we found that bats are particularly sensitive to lighting, external lighting of the west of the church. Now, I have to be honest here and say that a bit more research is needed to understand why. We think that it could be something to do with lighting the tower. Potentially it's something to do with the fact that the sun sets in the west. Does it have an influence on emergence times, for example? But it is something to be aware of, especially when external lights are being potentially changed or replaced. And I just really wanted to highlight this because we do know that lighting is an important factor. And the I just really wanted to highlight the National Bat Helpline, the free advice service for more information for churches that are looking to change and to do anything with their external lighting. So to summarise then, half of our churches house bats, but that is so much more. When we're looking at the older churches, it's more like 3/4 of the churches house bats. So when we're looking at works with those older churches, it's actually safer, I think, to assume that the church will have bats. And fortunately, most churches live people caring for churches, I should say, live happily alongside their bats. But as I said before, Kate will talk a bit more about our legacy and about the support that we'll provide for churches in the future. We found that bats were most likely to use the older church buildings in more agricultural landscapes, and particularly arable. And that we found that bats, for the first time, are particularly sensitive to light on the west side of church buildings. And actually, that's all from me at the moment, but I just wanted to say another big thank you to the volunteers, because it was only with their dedication and hard work, of course, to the churches as well, and of course to the National Lottery Heritage Fund and the lottery players for making it possible. And I also want to give a big shout out to Steve Langton, actually, who was the person that did the statistics here. If anybody has any questions at lunch around the statistics, I will do my very best to answer it, but I might have to get back to you on some of the details. So that's it from me. That's enough from me talking, but I think it's maybe lunchtime.
Thank you so much, Claire. Everyone has been extremely swift this morning, so we have, in fact, 20 minutes extra for lunch, and I think that's wonderful because it's more time to speak to each other. What I will say is the caterers have been told 12:15, so let's let them work to that if they're not ready yet. I'm looking at the caterers. Is 12:15 okay, guys? 12:15. So if you could mingle and chat amongst yourselves for 20 minutes or so, they will be ready to serve you your food. Enjoy the break, and we'll see you again at 1:15. Thanks so much, everyone.
Okay, welcome back, everybody. I hope you enjoyed the lunch. I'm Kathy. I'm Communications Officer for Bats in Churches, and I'm here with representatives of our partner organisations, who I will introduce you to in just a moment. Before we do that, just a bit about this morning, which was a fantastic example of some of the work that we've done in Bats in Churches. It makes me really proud to see my colleagues and friends and partners of the project up here talking about the great work that they've been doing. And it also reminds me that we really are only a small part of what Bats in Churches is. You know, Bats in Churches is all of you here, all of our church communities, all of our volunteers, and everybody that we've worked with over the past 5 years. So we're here this afternoon to discuss some of the finer points of the project in terms of key learnings, and also something about the future of the project and its legacy. So I'm happy to introduce you to our panellists. We have Navroza Lada, who is Chief Legal Governance and External Affairs Officer at Natural England. She's joined by Jen Heathcote, who is Head of Investigative Services at Historic England. Then to my left, we have Emily G, who is Director of the Cathedrals and Church Buildings Division at the Church of England. And finally, we have Kit Stoner, who is CEO of Bat Conservation Trust. So we're going to get straight into it with our questions for the panellists. These are a mixture of questions that have been created by us internally, and also questions that have come in from delegates who are here today or have expressed an interest in the event. So the first thing that I'm going to ask all of our panellists in turn is, what are your organisation's main learnings from the project, and has there been anything surprising or unexpected? Who would like to start us off?
Thank you, Jen. Okay, hi, Jen, Historic England. So I would like to say that personally, the biggest surprise for me is just how much joy this project has brought to me personally, as well as I know the impact of it has been significant to the communities that it's helped. Initially, it has been a very long haul, though. At times, in the early stages, it was remarkably challenging. It's been both the most difficult project that I've been involved with, but also one of the ones that has, as I say, not only brought me joy, but also made me very proud to be associated with it.
Navroza.
Thank you. I think one of the key learnings, and it's come about really strongly actually this session today, is it's the power of partnership. I think the challenge that was faced in this particular scenario, I mean, it was a big challenge with lots of competing interests, you know, from protected species to people to community, and how do you bring that all together? And I think there's something there about collaboration, because no one person or organisation can possibly do this by themselves. And I was really interested to hear early on about how actually the partnership, you know, when it started off, you know, there were a few wrinkles there. And I think that's fine. I think that's okay, because what was really great about this is that having different perspectives around the table. If you're really going to tackle some of those really difficult challenges, you need that diversity of thought. And I think what came across for me for this partnership working piece is how strong that partnership is, actually, how you've worked together, we've all worked together, that trust that is there, and actually how it's led to some really, really brilliant outcomes. So I think a key learning that we'll take back to Natural England is how this is a brilliant exemplar of how, if you work together, you can really tackle some of those really tricky issues. You know, the mission for Natural England is how do we recover nature through partnership working, and I think this is a cracking example of that. But I think beyond just the partners in this project, there's something that's come across really strongly for me. And again, I'll take this back, which is around community. You know, how important community is, how important volunteers are. And I think when we look back and we think, God, this is a big problem, how do we make sure that we're all doing our bit for it? I think the other learning, have I got time to carry on? I think the other learning for me is around innovation. And again, I think that's something that we can certainly take back to Natural England as a bit of learning. You know, the Bats in Churches class licence was a really innovative way of looking at things. How can we do mitigation in a slightly different way? How can we really be part of the solution in a slightly different way? And we'd not done that before, and it took a bit of courage to say we're going to do things slightly differently. And the kind of things that we thought were really novel there, we've had the real opportunity to test that, which has been really, really great. And then I think finally for us in terms of learning, I think it's been just, you know, that evidence piece. We Natural England, we're an evidence-led organisation. How we connect people with nature is a really important part of what we do. And I think hearing all the evidence that's been collated in terms of what works in communities, what works in terms of outreach in our schools. And I think that the citizen science bit that we heard about earlier, some of that data was brilliant. So I think what I'm saying is we've learnt loads and we'll be taking loads back to Natural England. Thank you.
Fantastic. Kit, Emily, who would like to go next?
Yep, I've got the microphone, so it looks like it's me. So all of what they said, for starters. I think one thing that we've really learned, and I hope it's something that we knew before the project, but it does epitomise it, I think, this project, is listening, not going in with assumptions of what churches need, or indeed what bats need in some cases. I'm sure ecologists would agree with that. I think in some cases it's very clear that there have been huge issues with droppings and urine, and it's affecting the community, it's affecting the use of the church. And in those situations, perhaps it's a little bit more obvious. But I mean, there's a beautiful example this morning of where actually the bats weren't causing the problems, but they wanted to use the bats to try and increase the numbers of people coming to the church. In other cases, it's understanding that people don't necessarily not like the bats, but they definitely don't like the mess. But it might be about where that mess is. It might be in a particularly sensitive part of the church, either from a religious point of view, or it might be a heritage point of view. So I think one of the things that's come across really strongly is don't make assumptions about what's needed for bats or church communities, but actually listen to the people that are in that church community. And I think there's some really good examples this morning about, you know, I think there were some options given to churches, for examples, that they were able to choose from. And that kind of leads me on to my next, which is perhaps more the unexpected point, is around, in that case, they chose the most expensive solution. But that one thing that's been unexpected for me is knowing that actually it doesn't always need huge mitigation works for solutions to be found. I think solutions have been found across the board. Of course, we've done some big capital works, and it's brilliant to see those working for some churches. But for many churches, actually really small things. I remember Kate talking a lot about some small portable vacuum cleaners quite a lot, and that's been transformative for some churches. Particularly where there are older congregations and they can't sort of heave the big ones with the cords around. The pew covers was another example where they have been custom built so they fit in with the church, and that could be really, really transformative again. So I think the kind of fact that it doesn't always have to be expensive, but you need to listen to what is needed and then try and fit the solution to that. And I think on a personal level, the fact that more churches that had bats liked bats was actually quite a surprise to me, because you do tend to hear more about churches that have issues with bats, which is completely understandable. So seeing that the results of Claire's survey, that actually quite a lot of the churches that have bats do like them and they do value them was very gratifying, I have to say.
Hi, I'm Emily from the Church of England. So I think one really important learning I think we've taken back in our teams is the importance of engaging with bats, understanding them, getting to know them, bats in churches, and sharing that advice and that recommendation with parish councils and with DAC colleagues to sort of just generally share the importance of getting to understand why they're there and how to manage them. So one way we've been doing that is embedding consideration of bats into job descriptions, for example, of roles looking after buildings in DACs, and I think that's an important way of sort of spreading that message. It's been really wonderful for us having the Bats in Churches colleagues. I've only been here for about 6 months of their time, but having them within Cathedral and Church Buildings department has been really wonderful. And you can imagine, having heard Anna and Diana speak this morning, and obviously Kathy and Rose, who's been referred to as well today, their infectious enthusiasm and commitment to the subject has been really important for kind of just standing up for bats at all times and reminding us to think about them in our conversation around looking after churches from a fabric point of view and from a people point of view. So that's been a really important message, just that their presence and their expertise has been a really important learning for us as well. I think the idea that bats can be and are an asset to historic church buildings is a really important message. It's come through a lot this morning. I mean, Kit just mentioned particularly that lovely North Yorkshire example of the sort of high percentage of the community engaging with that church because of its bats. And I think thinking about them as an asset rather than, oh gosh, a dramatic thing that needs to be dealt with and a pressure and an expense is important. I had a chat with a colleague last night in the office and discovered, I didn't realise this before, that she looks after a church many miles from her in South Oxfordshire, a Norman church, which has bats. And she said they had this huge community event and far many more people than come in for regular, or had been coming in for regular worship, came to the bats event to learn about them. And she made bat-shaped cookies and brought them. And it was just a wonderful kind of thinking about the bats in the church as an asset, as a community asset. So I think that's a really important learning for us all to keep in mind. And then the third point really is just the point that's been made a number of times this morning, really, that complete removal of bats from churches is not likely, not a possibility, and indeed not something that we should hope for. So it's really thinking about much more practical and fairly modest protective measures and cleaning regimes, and that those fairly low-cost solutions can really be quite transformative. And it's wonderful to see all the worked examples of that this morning and to continue to share those together. Thanks.
Thank you, Emily. We're going to move on to our next question, which is I'm going to ask each of our panellists how they will be embedding what they've learnt from the project into their individual organisations. But I just have to take this opportunity to say, if anybody wants to embed Emily's bat-shaped cookies into their organisation, there is a recipe on the Bats in Churches website. So please do check that out. Okay, so Navrosa, can we start with you for how you'll be embedding the learnings of the project into National England? We are going to need to be concise with this one because we have plenty to get through. Thank you.
So, I've already said partnership is key, collaboration is key. We've built such close relationships. We need to build on that, and we will continue building on that. We'll chair the Project Legacy Group. That's a contribution that we want to continue making. I mentioned the Bats in Churches license. We will continue with that. We'll think about how that fits in with our earned recognition scheme. We've already taken some of the legacy bits of this project already into our Bats Advice Service contract, which BCT will be delivering for us. So there's already loads of practical things, but I think my key thing is this has been such a brilliant project that I want to keep banging the drum about how successful it is when we go back to Natural England. There's something about this legacy is important for this project, but way beyond that. And just finally, on creativity, I mentioned innovation earlier. One of the things that I loved when I looked at it, because I didn't know this was part of it, was the children's book. And I believe that wasn't on the radar initially. That came along. And it's that kind of learning that I want to really bottle and take back to Natural England and say, we might not have thought of things from the outset, but actually, you know, these kind of creative things can come along, whether it's your bat cookies or whether it's your books.
Wonderful, thank you. Jen?
Okay, so for me, I think there are two elements. In terms of very practical, everyday learning that we're going to embed, we are already embedding within the organisation, is to expect bats in historic structures. So plan for finding them, plan for finding an ecologist that you can work with who speaks your language, who you can learn to speak their language and work together. And I think the evidence that we heard from Claire's last talk before lunch really just underlines that point, that particularly if we're thinking about our medieval churches, the likelihood is greater that you will find them than that you won't. More broadly, I think that we will be taking the approach about having respectful, honest and open discussions, even when we are disagreeing with each other, into not just the work around bats in churches, but into everything that we do. And particularly in this interface between managing, preserving, conserving, protecting the natural and the cultural environments, that is going to be essential, that we turn that into business as usual rather than something that is so unusual that we are celebrating the partnership. So that for me is the talking bit, but also the active listening, learning to really listen and understand other people's points of view, to learn what is important to them and how what you do can honour that, as well as get a good outcome for the thing that you are tasked for protecting as well.
Thank you, Jen. Emily, I feel like you already began touching on how you're embedding the learnings into the Church of England, but do you have more to say on that?
Yes, thanks, Kathy. Yeah, there are a number of ways, and I'll just run through some thoughts, really. One is about kind of consolidating our relationship with the Bats Conservation Trust. I think it's really important that we keep alive those that relationship in particular, and think about how we can embed access to the advice that the Conservation Trust provides, and indeed other partners around the table do as well. There's also a point about advocacy, and I mentioned about, you know, Honor, for example, speaking up in a team meeting to remind us, you always don't forget the bats. And I think it was something at Historic England, I remember in the early days when we were thinking about buildings all the time, there was a kind of don't forget the landscapes mantra, which Drew will know, and that sort of sat with me always, and it's kind of there. And I think the same thing with bats, you know, don't just always think, but what is it from their perspective? So we're kind of embedding that sort of gentle challenge. Building bat awareness and empathy, mindfulness of where bats might be into job descriptions is something that we're thinking about doing, particularly I mentioned in sort of diocesan advisory roles, but also in the church building support officer posts that we're funding through Buildings for Mission. I think that's quite a simple and quite visible way of encouraging greater mindfulness of bats. Also into church building management plans, which is an area of sort of emerging, thinking about how to have efficient management, maintenance plans for groups of churches. Again, but embedding into those how to be mindful of bats with maintenance plans. Likewise with net zero work, you might know the Church of England's got an extraordinary goal of achieving net zero across all the churches and cathedrals and other buildings by 2030. But a really interesting conversation came up in a team meeting when we were talking about insulation, which obviously is really important for net zero, but might have implications for bats. So having that kind of integrated, sort of intersectional thinking is really important when considering net zero. And lastly, the Church Heritage Record, which is one of the things that we maintain for public use, has added a section of putting the presence of bats into the ecological record of the section of the CHR. So those are hopefully a few ways to demonstrate that we're embedding practice about bats in churches.
Thank you, Emily.
well, clearly we already have bat-shaped cookies embedded into our strategy, so we don't need to do anything there. I think since you've talked so much about bats, I'd like to talk a bit more about churches. So I think a couple of the ways that we want to continue supporting churches at VCT is increasing that. So you already mentioned the Bat Advice Service, which is funded by Natural England, and we are looking to provide more specialist support for churches through the National Bat Helpline. So I hope that will be helpful in taking forward the legacy of the project. And also supporting our bat groups to support churches. Many of the bat groups and many of the volunteers have already been involved in the project, and there has been some training done along that. Churches are complex buildings, and not all bat group volunteers have experienced work with churches before. So actually kind of skilling them up to be able to help churches is a really, really important part of the legacy. And I think the other part to mention is actually we've got so many resources that have come out of this project. We've got so much technical knowledge that's come out. The creativity of the ecologists has just been incredible, and the architects as well. So I think that's something that we will definitely want to take forward and use in our training. We work with architects and a number of different sectors in other heritage buildings as well. So I think making sure that we are embedding all of that learning into what we're doing in terms of guidance and training will be really, really crucial.
Thank you, Kit. So our next question is looking at the outcomes of our project. We obviously have a lot to be proud of, but here at Bats in Churches, we still get regular contact from new churches in need of support and advice. So how will the partners ensure that legacy is retained to make the most of what we've done at Bats in Churches and support churches in the future? And what kind of funding options are realistic? And I'm going to nominate Jen.
Thought you might. Okay, so another two-parter from me. The first thing that I want to acknowledge in terms of the legacy is that we already have a fabulous toolkit. A toolkit that has been designed, developed, and disseminated over the 5 years, but which will be there in perpetuity. So I'm referencing the accessible online and hard copy information about cleaning and the workshops that have been held and the people who've been trained through those workshops who will go out to spread the word to other churches using this hub and spoke model that was there from embedded in the outset of the project. There's also the legacy of sharing best practice, again, with professionals. And when I say professionals, I mean architects, I mean ecologists, and there are in-person fora where that best practice will be shared, but also there is a journal article, peer-reviewed journal article that will be published, which captures a lot of that learning that will be available. And then there are also the statements of heritage significance, which Antje and the consultants have been busily creating. Almost 100 of those will have been produced and will be recorded on various platforms for people to reference. So there is a legacy in terms of that practical toolkit. But the bit that you really want to know about, I know, is what is going to be the legacy of the approach that has been taken. And there are no promises yet, but we are exploring ideas at the moment for creating a 2 to 3 year pilot where we put in, we being the collective we, so I'm talking internally, but I'm hoping that others will join us, to create a fund. And from that fund, churches will be able to apply into that for very small, very modest amounts of money. We're thinking of around £500. But we know, we have the evidence to demonstrate, that grants of that scale can make a significant difference to churches, the people caring for them, and the communities that use them. So those grants would be used to pay for things like you've heard about already, pew covers, catch trays, modern vacuum cleaners, and the occasional ad hoc deep clean with professional cleaners supporting the volunteer cleaners. And in return for those grants, we envisage there being a menu of nature-based options that those church communities could then offer in return for receiving that grant. So that is the ambition. As I say, we can't promise what scale that grant would be, but we are getting positive feedback internally. So I invite my partners on the stage and anybody else who's out there to consider joining us in that.
Thank you, Jen. Emily, I'm going to go to you next and ask you the same question that I asked Jen.
Thank you. Just 2 points really about legacy, other than the points we've already made about kind of embedding our learnings. But one is just sort of remembering, as we've seen so many times this morning, that churches really do provide, and many of them are providing, a sanctuary for a very important and protected species. And kind of thinking a little bit more about the church as a habitat and our work on sort of biodiversity of the church as a whole, thinking about the churchyard and the creatures that call it home. So I think there's interesting things to just think about in terms of how we deal with archaeology as an analogy, thinking about archaeology on farmland in sort of agricultural context, and thinking about perhaps some level of support on a wider level through bats as an analogy in a church. And then I think really we've learned today that really relatively modest funding can make a huge difference, and it's just really heartwarming to hear what Jen set out there. And I think that would be one of our biggest sort of asks or thoughts about legacy, really, is to have access to relatively modest amounts of funding, which could provide that, these kind of protective measures, or indeed the cleaning support, or indeed the vacuum cleaners, which I think is quite simple things, can make a heck of a difference to those who are worshipping and looking after and caring for our really important historic buildings. So be interesting to see how that develops. Thank you.
The microphone. So, there's a couple of things. So building on what Jen said, VCT is going to be putting in an application next week to the Church of England Buildings for Mission Fund, and that's with a view to trying to get a Bats in Churches officer for the next 2 years. So that will expand even further on the funding that Natural England is giving to the Bat Advice Service, and will hopefully be able to, if we're successful, we'll provide even more specialist support for churches going forward. So please, everybody, cross your fingers for that one. And as Jen said, we're hoping that potentially partners will be able to provide quite small amounts of money towards that grant scheme, because it seems from everything that we've heard that these small amounts of money might not be very big to some, but they make a massive difference for some churches. And I hope Drew doesn't mind me saying, but we will be talking to Heritage Fund as well to see if there is potential for building on some of the legacy of this project. And just on a more sort of smaller, perhaps and practical note, just to mention the Bat Advice Service. One element of that will be training up volunteers, but another element will be trialling a sort of presence and absence service using volunteers, so that churches, when they're going to be doing maintenance works, they may not know that they've got bats or not. And so we're going to be doing a pilot to see whether volunteers can at least let them know whether they need to be considering bats from that early stage or whether they don't.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jen. Navrosa.
Thank you. So I think the Bats in Churches legacy group is going to be a really, really important group. So I think Natural England will continue to lead and chair that. I think the other thing I just wanted to mention was that our area teams will be continuing to engage with churches around that potential conflict sometimes between wildlife and nature recovery, and to provide support at a much more local level. And then just finally on funding, although we can't make any promises over the next few months, we too will be looking at what kind of small scale grant funding we might be able to offer too.
Wonderful, thank you. Moving on to our next question. This was a question that came in from several delegates, so we thought it was sort of well worth bringing to the panel regarding the cost of bat surveys and mitigation. And again, in the project, we get a lot of people, a lot of church communities asking how much is a bat survey, and obviously the answer is it depends. But what we have found is that church communities are often quite surprised by ecological fees. So what can we all do to raise awareness of the importance of ecological works and surveys, and how to prepare for them if you do have bats? And Kit, I'm going to go to you.
You might come to me first for that one. I think the project has done a huge amount of raising awareness already, and I think all of us as partners should continue to try to do that in any communications we have with churches. I think communication with funders is also really important, because my understanding is that in some cases funders don't necessarily cover ecological surveys. but they will cover architects' fees. So I think we really need to think about architects and ecologists as the same thing. They're both integral parts, and you could probably see from the examples this morning, the ecologists and the architects are working hand in hand to try and come up with these solutions. But you will always need to understand where the bats are, how they're using the buildings before you get to that point, and for that you do need an ecologist. So I think it's not just churches understanding that, but making sure that we're understanding where the bats are, whether they need an ecologist from a very early point. I think it was Phil that made the point earlier on around if there's any way of trying to integrate bat mitigation into roof works, or other maintenance works that are needed. That's a really good way of saving on ecology fees, because you're going to need to do those surveys anyway, but also more practical things like scaffolding. So I think there are kind of a number of ways to try and, it's probably not answering the question because it's not raising awareness, but I think the considerations that we need to take into account, it's kind of being efficient and trying to put things together where you can, when you're needing an ecologist, for funders to understand that they need to be paying for all of the fees when churches are planning works or planning mitigation of some kind, and that's the architects and ecologists.
Thanks, Kit. Navrosa, I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, I think, so all of that, I think what I would say is really about proportionality, because I think there's something here, we'll do our bit, by the way, to help awareness as well in terms of these kind of costs. But in proportionality, I think there is something about trying some of those softer options first and understanding what may work before having to expend a lot of money. We heard earlier that sometimes those things can work, sometimes things won't work. And I think there's just something here about sometimes you have to try and test it and see. So I think my key message is, just keeping proportionality at the forefront.
Brilliant, thank you. Jen, can I come to you next?
Yeah, I'd just like to build on that point about proportionality, because I think it's really one of the most important things we can do about raising awareness is actually just how integral having your ecologist on board from the outset is to designing the bespoke solution that is going to work for your church in your setting. And without that ecologist, you're not going to get the same level of attention to detail that helps you do that and identify the right soft intervention that's going to give you your desired outcome. So I don't mean this to sound glib. I know that people are strapped for cash, but actually investing in your ecologist up front is potentially a really good way of saving money further down the line and not having to invest in capital works that are unnecessary.
Thank you. Colleagues have mentioned, I think, a lot of the key points there. I guess the only things I would add is just a general point about always building recommendations and reminders into advice and guidance across the piece, so that there's a recurring theme of thinking about where that's relevant here, and that could touch on, as you say, the points about the importance of working with an ecologist. And then I think the other thing is really just about case studies. It always seems to me to be the best way of building awareness, is kind of testimony and advocacy from individuals who've had lived experience of something, sharing the challenges of it and the successes of it and showing how they worked it through. I think that's often quite a compelling way of raising awareness amongst those who are dealing with similar issues and sharing best practice, really. So case studies. Thanks.
Wonderful. Plenty of case studies over at the back there for anybody who's interested. Okay, we're coming to our final question, and we're right on time, so thank you, everybody. This has been a particularly successful partnership, as we all know. So I'm interested to hear from each of you what action your organisation will take to keep these connections that we've established between us strong and effective after the partnership ends. Navrosa, I'll come to you first, please. Thank you.
I think this is critically important because, as I say, I see throughout the organisation, I see a lot of partnerships that we enter into. This, I think, is a fantastic exemplar of how we've got a really strong partnership. So there's something there. I'm going to mention the legacy group that we're going to chair again, but there's just something there about how we keep that going, how we keep these relationships going strongly, but also how we can bring in other partners as well potentially. And we have key links into our partners within Natural England, including one of our directors on the science side links directly into the Church of England. But we have all those levels of linkages. But I think the key thing, though, for me about the partnerships, and I think this is something I really want to take back to Natural England, is how we keep telling the story, because there's something here about we can maintain these relationships, we can continue, we can give that commitment to do that. But equally, I think there's a commitment for us at Natural England just to keep saying, because if you do that and you invest in that, it really reaps benefits.
Wonderful, thank you. Jen.
Yes, all that, and this partnership existed before Bats in Churches was a thing. And that is in no way detracting from the amazing injection of enthusiasm, capability, capital, and expertise that the grant gave us and enabled delivery of all of the things that you see around you today. But I think it is worth just reflecting on the fact that there has been a core partnership for well over a decade that has been discussing on how best to tackle this issue. Bats in Churches has moved us significantly further forward. The Legacy Group is a formal entity that will continue to move us towards the next step. And so, whilst Bats in Churches investment strengthened this partnership, it didn't create it, and therefore I see no reason to be anxious that it will dissolve anytime.
Thank you, Jen. Emily.
Yeah, I think the importance of continuing to work together in partnership feels fundamental to this, really. Maintaining those conversations through the Legacy Group, sharing examples with each other as we carry on, sharing challenges, I think will be really important. So a commitment from us to continue those conversations and work with colleagues is very much there. And then I think there's a real sense that we've learned so much from it, through colleagues' good work. And the main sort of lessons about taking the soft approach first, I think, is a pretty fundamental piece of advice to sort of share with the church community more widely. So now that we've got the case studies, now that we've got potentially some future resources, but certainly extraordinary amounts of research, advice, and guidance, and really practical things out there, I think we've got a lot to offer to those who are thinking about the best way to live with bats, to celebrate bats, and to celebrate the extraordinary historic buildings in their care. So continuing those conversations in partnership, we're very much committed to that, and I think there's a lot more that we can continue to do together.
Thank you. I was talking to Jen about this morning, and we were reflecting on the fact that this has come a long way, and the last 5 years has certainly ramped it up quite considerably. The injection of money has made a massive difference, but we have been working together on this very challenging issue for a very long time now. I think, as Lisa mentioned in her talk this morning, we have had some ups and downs in that partnership. And actually, without wishing to sound a little cliched, it has made us stronger. We've learned a lot from each other. And to be honest with you, we have to maintain the partnership. Look what it's achieved. It would be absolutely crazy for us not to maintain this partnership and to keep on learning from each other. And I think also it's important to emphasise it's not just about the national partnerships, it's about the local partnerships as well. So there are many bat groups and church communities who've formed partnerships as part of this project, and indeed some of them were already talking to each other before the project, but I think that number has increased hugely. So it's not just about us as organisations working together, but it's about the different communities working together on a local level as well.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Thank you to all of the panellists, to Navrosa from Natural England, Jen from Historic England, Emily from Church of England, Kit from Bat Conservation Trust. There have been some very interesting and useful answers, and thank you very much for your time. Thanks.
know where you're going? Yes, thank you. Diana, are you ready to go? Okay. Wait. What's Sue? Yes. Okay. Oh, thank you. Sorry. So the next section, we're going to hear from a few of our churches, just a little snapshot into their church and what their issues are or how they go about their lives there, really. It's called The Secret Lives of Churches, this little section. So first up, it is Sue Willets from Braunston. So Sue, if you'd like to make your way to the stage, and we'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much.
Okay, I'm Sue Willets, Church Warden of All Saints in Braunston, which is shown here. This is the south elevation, and circled in blue is the general roof area in the south aisle roof space. Have a good look at the picture. You might recognise it from the front of your books that you've all been given today. As a church, we have been delighted to have been a pilot church for the Bats in Churches project. I hope our experience has been helpful in formulating procedures for other churches who need assistance in future. We had a colony of 40 or so bats for many years. We lived with them in reasonable harmony. But in May 2013, a chimney collapsed at a house about 400 yards away, and that is when our problems began, with massive collections of droppings below the roost and also around the church. I sought help, but nothing of any use. I invited the local MP in September 2014. He sent out a press release, and within days we gained publicity of our cause, but no practical help. I was able to attend the meeting in May 2016, prior to the second Heritage Lottery application, and once that was successful, we were invited to be one of the pilot churches for the project. I jumped at the chance. The surveys that took place in the summer of 2017 confirmed that the bats left their roost, flew around the church, returned to the roost, as they were then able to exit the roost and go outside and feed, and that is through the blue area that we saw earlier. The ecologist confirmed the bats had no need to fly in the church and agreed that the gaps could be blocked, in the first instance temporarily, and if successful, permanently. The results of the first summer surveys were presented to all interested parties on the 1st of November 2017. That was a wonderful meeting, and the agreed outcome was to target the first week of May to carry out the temporary blocking. Lots of documentation and permissions were processed in the intervening weeks, scaffolding booked, contractor sought, and so on. It was a very close-run thing, too close for comfort, really. In the end, the faculty permission was received by Braunston PCC on the 23rd of April, which was actually the same day that the scaffolding was erected to begin the work. There were serious frustrations, and we were in danger of not having all permissions in place before the scheduled start date. Following the temporary blocking, the bats were surveyed again in the summer of 2018, which confirmed no detrimental effect on the numbers of bats in the roost, and so we were able to permanently block the gaps using lime mortar. In the first week of May 2018, that's what we did, again, we experienced very slow responses from the DAC, which put the work in jeopardy and increased the grey hairs of the church wardens. This is Braunston's legacy, our experience and frustrations in getting faculties agreed in a timely manner has helped to streamline the processes for other churches and DACs, especially for faculty and bat licensing. Every project church has a statement of significance, and DACs have been informed that there is a small window when building work can take place in areas with a bat roost, as it must usually take place outside the bat maternity season. So in summary, We have been bat-free in the interior of the church since 2018 and are so very, very grateful for all the help and assistance we have received. We're pleased to have contributed to the project to support churches in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sue. It's really good to hear from you. So next up, we have Jane O'Connor from Stevington Church in Bedfordshire. Jane is just making her way up now, and we will look forward to hearing what you've got to say, Jane. Thank you so much for being here. Again, at quite short notice, Jane, so thank you.
Is that on? Oh, that's good. Right. My name's Jane O'Connor. I'm from a very small village in North Bedfordshire called Stevington. And we have our St Mary's Church is at the edge of the village, and it's very near the River Ouse, and it's surrounded by farmland, mainly arable, but we do have cattle and quite a growing number of sheep. And we also have woodland, which you would think would be a perfect place for bats. And it is, and it's a perfect place for people as well. And my little story is both anecdotal and not very dramatic, because it's about successes, I think, and about quiet successes, and how we live as a community. And I think that has been that key word throughout the whole day, about community. And ours is very much one of community working together. Our church, carry on. Our church is, like a lot of churches, a medieval church, and it sits atop a holy well. And so we have lots of visitors. And if you just want to run through those pictures of the church, it's very simple. Because it was a holy well, in medieval times it was taken over by a priory at a local village of nuns, and there was a hospice. So it has that sort of quiet dignity, I think, and is well known for being tranquil. And the bats really like it. And we've had a very healthy population of bats, actually. Natterers, brown long-eared, and pipistrelle. And we were very excited to be involved in Bats in Churches when they approached us to help us along. Now, you would think that perhaps the community would be a little bit apathetic, or perhaps not very interested in our bats, but actually, or sort of a bit like this sort of poupée at the pew end. But no, they could have been like the next one, perhaps drowning their sorrows in the bat population. But no, we're actually really, really very lucky in that we have a community that, on the whole, are very interested in their environment around them. So much so that I've actually bought a book to show you. And it's just really an example of what our village is like. So we had several people come together and a whole group of people surveying the different areas for biodiversity in our village. And it created this fantastic book, which I'm actually going to give to Honor because she has been so good to us. So what have we done about our bats? Well, as I say, we had quite a healthy population, and like most churches, we've had to cover up the pews and cover up all the areas that might be vulnerable. And we've been able, thanks to going to the cleaning workshops as well, think about how we can manage our bats without having to do mitigation at all, which we haven't. We also have a bit of an advantage because I have a son who's an ecologist and he's a Batman. So, perfect, couldn't have done it better. So he has been able to help us along the way. Most importantly, he's been able to help us with creating lots of events for our village. So we've had bat prowls, bat walks, bat everything really. And he has been great. So children and adults have really enjoyed coming of an evening to possibly have some hot dogs and drinks, but also to prowl around the church and the churchyard with bat detectors and look at the infrared cameras. So it's been really, really interesting. Much more curiosity rather than people who are not interested at all. So from there, we were being really, really pleased that we received grants from Bats in Churches and Natural England to create a special event last year called Stevington Goes Wild. So the whole event was a weekend. We started off with a bat prowl, then we put out, or my son did, put out the moth boxes so that we could see what kind of food was available for them. And surprisingly, there were a lot of moths there the next day. Admittedly, it was very sunny and nice, and okay, it was good, because we had been a little bit worried that our bat population was declining, and indeed it had. There is a happy ending, though, to that one. So alongside that, we then had, during the day, we had a lovely festival in the churchyard where we had a local man who looks after rescued birds. He brought those, so there was lots of interest in the owls. Storytelling with environmentally friendly stories, lots of that. And we had somebody from Wildlife Trust come to talk about things with activities. We had planting of edible flower and vegetable seeds. We had bug hotels, the lot. So it was really, really beautiful day and so encouraging, followed by the next day with a service in the church celebrating God's creation. So that was a really good start. And since then, we've been continuing with things like that. Our church, along with the benefices around us, have started Wild Church, where we go to the different churches in the benefice and talk and do various activities. My son's continuing with the bat prowls, so that's a good thing. And although we thought we didn't have, we were thinking of a declining population, this year it seems to have improved again. Whether we just happen to be counting around the time of the nursery, I don't know. But they do seem to be quite happy. There may be a couple of factors that are the reason for this. But possibly because our farmers who are around are now thinking about their environment a little bit more and growing hedgerows, and they're also setting aside areas for insects and for birds. So that might be one reason. And another reason is that people in the village are doing things like No Mow May and are thinking more about their environment, which is a good thing. We've also got started, some of the offshoots of all this have been really good, not just because of Bats in Churches, but it's been working alongside. And that has been, we have a Stevington Environment Group, interested in the bigger picture, but also about the domestic, about how we can look after our community. That's really good. We have a young offshoot called YES, Young Environments of Stevington, who are thinking about, yes, we're going to save our environment as much as we can. So from there, we also have, can't think what we do have now, but it has been a very positive outcome. So thanks to Bats in Churches, Natural England, and Honor, thank you very much indeed for coordinating with us all that time. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jane. That was absolutely wonderful. Brilliant stuff. So next up, we have Lynn from... Oh, you're right there. Sorry, Lynn. I was looking back for you. It's Lynn, everybody. Please welcome Lynn from Keyston. We're going to hear a little bit about her church now. Thank you.
turn my own slides, but we'll see how we go. Okay, so hi, I'm Lynn Johnston. I'm on the Parochial Church Council for Keyston. Keyston is St John the Baptist Church. Keyston is in Huntingdon in Cambridgeshire. We've only been involved with Bats in Churches. I think we were probably the last or a very late project church, and we were really pleased to be part of the project, but it was a little bit late in the day and we were hit quite early by COVID, so we haven't made as much progress on some areas as some of those you've heard today, but I'm really pleased to share with you what we've done and where we're at. We don't have church wardens, we don't have a vicar in our church at the minute. I'm sort of affectionately known as the Bat Lady, but that's... honestly, I don't really know much about bats at all, and it's been a great pleasure to learn about bats through this process and to continue to learn. So Keyston is a small village on the Cambridgeshire-Northamptonshire border. It's a rural community. There's about 70 households in it, no village amenities in the village at all, just a post box, a village hall and a pub. We have quite a large church, grade 1 listed church. And it's very large for the size of the village, and that really just reflects the sort of manorial status that Keyston and its surrounding village had at the time. And it's got some quite interesting, very old features. It is one of those medieval churches that was mentioned earlier, and so consequently, yes, we do have bats. And apparently the bats have been there for a while. I've only lived in the village since 2018, so I'm new to all of this, but apparently there were bats there for quite some time. So, and therefore, you know, all the nice features of the church have been affected by bats over time. So, who are the bats? So we do have, apparently, quite an important colony of Natterer's bats, maternity colony of Natterer's bats in the church, as well as the usual soprano and common pipistrelle. And it has been surveyed twice, or three times now. So first in 2019, when the church council at the time decided to do something about the bats, find out about more about it by Natural England, and then subsequently by our ecologist introduced to us through Bats in Churches, Barry Collins, in 21 and 22. We had some evidence apparently from the earlier survey as long-eared bats, but apparently we don't have any of those left now. Interesting to hear about the sort of environment. So we are surrounded very much by an arable land. You know, it is a rural community of an arable community. Barry Collins's survey did make note of the fact that the village itself, if you look at an aerial view of the village, you will see it's sort of like an oasis in the land around of all the intensively modified landscape, as he called it. So what we've got here is a lot of trees, a lot of land with trees around it, a big churchyard, and a big church. And we think that's why the bats turned up in our place. So as a result of this, we've probably got, I think it was the last count, about 100 Natterer's bats in there. I'm not sure exactly of the number of soprano and pipistrelle. But as a result of this, the church is pretty much rarely used. It's been rarely used since 2018. We had 2 services a year prior to COVID, and the cost of the impact of the bats is such that the cost of the cleaning is really cost prohibitive for us to have any services. So with Barry's support and also our architect, we have got some bat mitigation works underway, but they're pretty expensive, and we, now coming to the end of our funding round, so we're going to be looking for money to be able to do something about it. So very little has been done in terms of that. However, one really exciting and interesting project that arrived as a result of the involvement of Bats in Churches was the opportunity to sort of protect some of our historical assets that we have in the church. So a report was conducted in June 2020, and it identified that we have this oak cadaver, which has been carbon dated back to 1400. It was identified by Dr. Christina Welch of the University of Westminster as an early example of this type of memorial, and a rare survival of an eviscerated sculpture dating from the early 15th century. And she considers this depiction of evisceration as probably unique, possibly the only surviving example in the country. And until recently, that oak sculpture, as you can see from the sort of third picture on from the left there, had just been sitting open in the church on a sort of open bier, exposed to all of the bat damage along the way. And so it had no protective covering, it had suffered a lot of structural loss, insect, pest damage, general degradation, paint had been missing, etc. And largely really from bat droppings, urine, and probably people not thinking what it was or even understanding the significance of it, so it was just left to one side of the church. And so with Bats in Church's help, we've been able to conserve or get this cadaver conserved and preserved from further damage. The conservation works were completed by Rachel Arnold, who's MA in RA Conservation, in 2021, which was also funded through Bats in Churches. And now it's in its purpose-built oak and perspex cover, as you can see in the far right-hand side, again, generously funded by Bats in Churches. And that oak structure was also built from local wood, which we're really proud of. So we had a service in May 2022, a service of celebration took place at the Keystone Church, and we had both of those experts there to tell us a little bit about the history and the conservation of the cadaver. So it's been a really, really important piece of work that has been uncovered and supported through the involvement of Bats in Churches, and we're really grateful for that. So what else have we been doing? Just really trying to raise awareness of the bats. You know, I'm feeling really inspired by all the stories of community, and we're just at the start of that. I really hope that we'll be able to do more of that going forward. So we've had bat surveys, we've had bat events. Again, Barry Collins and Bats in Churches have helped us. The Brownies are really, really keen, got them coming again next week, and been able to give them the challenge badge to do the Bats in Churches activities. And we've also got 15 bat boxes installed in the churchyards, which was one of the sort of lower level mitigations that Barry Collins recommended for us. So again, most of our the village isn't too involved at the moment. A few people are, but a lot of the support's come from Bats and Cambridgeshire bat groups, and also from really, I guess, friends of bats who live in towns and villages around and about. So that's the last thing I just wanted to say. I know I'm over time, sorry. So what help do we need? I was asked to sort of perhaps highlight this. You know, it's not an active church. We don't have any services that can raise any funds. It costs us around £500 to clean the churches each time. We probably need to think about trying to use some of the tools that have been promoted today. The biggest challenge for us is the funding requests that we do have. It's great to hear today from the panel that you're looking at funding, you're looking at making sure that small amounts are available. Our bat mitigation costs are going to be about £163,000. We don't have that. And therefore we're going to need large amounts of money. And actually it's really bureaucratic, both in the local diocese and with all of the sort of funding. We understand why, all the funding bodies, but it makes it really, really difficult to get funding. It takes time. Sometimes they need to have match funding. At the moment, we don't really have any fundraising activities. They aren't easy to pull together quickly. So our sort of request is really how can we make that process simpler and easier, and particularly when you're trying to put in mitigations in a Grade 1 listed building. The idea of creative thinking, of innovation and experimentation is brilliant, but also there needs to be some balance between, you know, what is acceptable and what isn't, and people perhaps being a bit more flexible and agile and considerate about that. So yeah, the role and the purpose of our church may need to change. We probably never go back to being a really truly viable church for worship, perhaps more than perhaps a couple of times a year, maybe a festival church. But what I'm really hopeful is that we can start to build a different future for the church, perhaps revolved around the bats, around the historical assets that we hold within the building, and it perhaps has a different purpose and meaning within our community in the future.
Thank you so much, Lynn. That was absolutely fabulous. Thank you. And the very best of luck with Keystone. It's a beautiful church. So next, we're going to hear a little bit more about some of those softer approaches we've been talking about today. So we are going to hear from Nigel from Archangel. Thank you so much for coming, Nigel. Again, you've been a last-minute substitution. Thank you for stepping up. And we're very glad to have an architect speaking this afternoon as well. So yes, I will leave it to you, Nigel, to tell us a little bit about Brampton and the sales.
Thank you very much. Is this on? Yes, thank you very much. Yes, I'm a conservation architect, and this church is not too far from Keystone. It's Brampton in Huntingdonshire, not Brampton in Cumbria. So if you imagine sort of a little wedge between the A1 and Huntingdon, that's where this is. It's another Grade 1 listed building, and I'm the inspecting architect for it. And I've sort of therefore inherited this mitigation project, which I can't even remember how it came to be nominated. But anyway, this is an example of, I suppose, a happy story and a simple story. So I won't take too long. Down? Yes. So this is the nature of the church, 14th century chancel, 15th century, most of it, 17th century tower, fantastic building. And in terms of the bat population, we've got two major areas of bat roosting and huge amounts of droppings at times, and they're both at the east end of the nave. So just in front of, sort of kind of where I am in this church, just in front of the chancel arch. There are a couple of other areas. Does this point? Yes, can you see them? Don't know. There's a couple of other areas at the east end of the south aisle and at the west end of the north aisle. But these are the major ones, and particularly on the south side, this seems to be the major one. And there's a lovely, it's a church with, you can see on the previous slide, there were trusses in the roof, and there's a truss right sort of close to that wall, and a lovely little gap to, kind of have a nice, to set up your colony if you're a bat. So that's sort of how we ended up with this. When we came on board, this report had already been done. So clearly led by an ecologist, this Burnwood Ecology, with their report, nice and thorough. And this was a set of suggestions that came out of this report. Whoops, sorry, what have I done? Ah, very good. So this is South Aisle, this is North Aisle. It's this bit that we're interested in, which is the one that went ahead. So the idea here was to do one of two things, as far as the report was concerned. Either build a shelf in here, that was sort of suggestion number one, or put some sails up, okay? So, and it's the sails that's what the project was, in this location only, okay? So just, which was dealing with the most invasive bit of the problem. I'm going to show you a couple of schemes. So this was the initial scheme that took this is our drawing that took the ecology report proposal into something that we could put before the DAC. And this drawing comprises, so this is the plan just showing the east end of the nave and the chancel arch. So the idea was to put these triangular sails up at high level. That's a cross-section at a smaller scale, showing the sails sort of drooping, so not canvas, but sail material with a little bit of a droop to it, we were imagining. And this on the right-hand side is the same sort of section, but a bit of the long section. So this is chancel, this is nave, and that would be what you would see of the sail. That then got some questions, key things that was sort of came into the process. First question was whether or not to drop the sail. So the initial idea was maybe they just stay up there all the time. So that would be a case of putting eyes into the masonry, and you just sort of clip carabiner hook or something. You clip your bit of droopy fabric onto that. Issue with that, of course, is it's very high. And when having done a good job of catching a nice lot of droppings, how do you actually unhook it? You can't unhook it all at once and drop it. So you would be unhooking a corner, and then they all fall out, of course. So you kind of not a great solution. quite apart from which it would be a significant maintenance or a significant revenue cost ongoing to get access safely up to that. So it seemed clear early on that we needed to have a means of dropping these sails. The second issue was if you just hang an awning, so a triangular piece of cloth effectively, the sides don't stay parallel with the wall. So they might be fixed at both ends, but it'll gape away from the wall. And given that the focus of the droppings was right up against the wall, there was a significant danger that you'd miss most of your droppings. So we needed something more rigid than something that was simply suspended. And then the third question, which, this is a sensitive, in a medieval church, which this is, sensitive location because at one point or other, it would have had a doom painting, fantastic doom painting. Probably, in this case, we don't believe it's still there, but, it can quite possibly be there underneath some lime wash. So in this particular sort of situation, there's a question as to whether or not there's a painting that you might be putting some fixings through. Okay, this is then, we worked with, we ended up selecting a provider. These guys, Tensile Fabric, they're based in Bristol, so they do sort of sail technology for all sorts of types of applications, sort of exhibitions and kind of all sorts of weird and wonderful stuff. So they're tensile fabric specialists. And they were good people to work with. And we ended up with a system that that was droppable, first thing, and that had the sail fabric within a frame. So I'll show you that on the next one, it'd be easier. So in addressing the to drop or not to drop, there's a winch. So you have, and my colleague Alex, who would have been a better person to do this presentation, but is on holiday, thankfully has a sailing background. So he was kind of on the kind of sailing stuff, because this is sailing technology. And he pointed out, if you've got this framed sail up at high level, and you've got, somebody wanting to clean it, and they unhook it, and they lose their control of the rope, then it hits them, at some speed, and that would not be a good outcome. So he was adamant we needed a winch. I think that's absolutely right. So it's a winch with a handle, both sides, so it's a detachable handle. You just go and lower it with the winch. So that was the first sort of thing that came into the scheme. And this is the solution to the framing of it. So the frame is just sort of 2 and a bit inches high, perhaps an inch wide, something like that, into which the fabric sits. So it's got some tension. It's a fairly flat surface. It's not got that droop that we were imagining at the outset. It's a flat surface, and it forms a sort of 3-sided tray. So in a sense, that's good for doing your catching job. Okay, and this is then the result. So it's happily the colour of the sail material is quite a good match for lime wash, actually. It's kind of a creamy off-white. And you come into the church, you don't really notice it at all. If you do notice it, it's kind of just sort of like some eyebrows. There was some discussion early on as to whether or not one could sort of decorate it with kind of liturgical kind of, whatever. But I think it's better kind of left to be modest and sort of fade into the background. And that's a closer view of it. So you can just see, up there, so we've got pulleys. So we've got 3 cables coming up from our winch position here. There's a little thing that gathers 1 cable into 3 cables. Dum, dum, dum. There's a 3-way pulley thing here, pulley there, and then the whole thing just drops in its orientation. And when it's dropped, the highest point at the middle is about 6 foot, and the lowest point is about 2.5 foot. So easy to, dustpan and brush, boom. In terms of costs, if you're interested in doing this, this particular thing, I think the tensile fabric cost was something like 6.5 grand. So it's not cheap as chips. It's not in your hundreds of thousands, put it that way. And you do need some, I suggest, some architectural input to get it right, the right solution for the particular building. So it does need to go with your inspecting architect. That's it. Thank you very much.
That was wonderful, Nigel. Thank you so much for that. So the next presentation is one we've been sent. It's another recording. This is from Alison Barnett, one of our ecologists from Mortimer Ecology. And here it is now.
Hello, everyone. Firstly, I'd just like to say thank you.
Yes, well, Alison's definitely here and she's ready to go. So without further ado, yes, let's hear straight from Alison.
Right, is it on? Yeah. Well, this is going to be a short one. It's going to be 5 minutes, so I'm going to be a bit fast, but any other question, just let us know at the end. So, clicker is down here. Right. No? Doesn't like it? No? The other way? Sorry about that. Right, so I'm just going to talk a bit about two things. First, some simple solutions to cover and protect our heritage assets, and later on a little bit about cleaning workshops that we have run across the country. So, covering objects, fantastic way to protect your objects, not only from bats, but from other things like dust. Things like the ones that we can see here, not the best aesthetically. 3 different colors of plastic, not good, not very environmentally friendly. The ones at the bottom, a little bit better, but yeah, we can do better. So we have some examples. We have here 2 churches, project churches. The first one is Phil Dorling, and the ones on this side is Hope Bowler. You can see they have gone from a blue tarpaulin to a nicer cloth that still protects the object, and in this case the pews, but is more aesthetically pleasing to the church. In this case, we have St. Andrew, and they have gone from that flimsy roll of plastic that is not environmentally friendly, that you have to dispose of and then buy again, to this nice cotton blue cloth, blue being the color of St. Andrew, so they chose that color. It's really nice, and it looks way better, and it protects the pews in here. Let's go with the next one, if it goes. Yeah, more things that we have done to protect the objects. You got a photo of me, I will go to it later on, but first we're going to start with some of those matte covers that you can see there protecting the ledge stones. This is Clothall Church, and we have just got a mat with a backing that's not damaging for the object and is protecting the ledge stones and also the brasses in the floor, not only from bad deposits, but also from people stepping on them, so we can preserve them for a little bit better. The top, like I said, is me. In this case, I'm covering a font with a piece of Tyvek. Tyvek is a really nice material. It's widely used in conservation in museums to protect objects, and it's breathable, it's waterproof, and it's dustproof. Unfortunately, it's well known, it's used as a roofing membrane that is not to be used where bats are present, because they could get entangled in the fibers, but it's fine to cover the objects in a church, especially the most important. Then we have this strange contraption in there, in the bottom. That is the Church of Walpole. And basically they have come up with a really clever, a simple solution for a problem, which is the deposits, the bat deposits that they were going into the pipes or the organ. A simple piece of mesh and a cable tie. That's all you need. What else? Heritage cleaning workshops. We have done 20. In fact, we've done 19. I'm doing the last one this weekend in Wellington, of all places. And we try to do these cleaning workshops to give the churches some options and some guidance on how to clean in a way that is sympathetic to the objects and in a preventive conservation way. So we can, the objects could still be here for future generations. We're aiming to reduce dust and dirt and, of course, getting rid of bad mess. We have trained around 200 people, not only project churches, because to those workshops have also come people from other churches in the neighboring areas. So this is really nice here. And this has also served as a community in gathering. And in this case, we have the Wigan Hall Community Clean that we put up with our CCT colleagues. And in this church, they only had 2 people clean the church and taking care of them. And after this community clean and the back walk that we did with Phil, a couple of more people have signed up to take care of the church. So that's a win for everyone. And everyone is really busy and taking pride. And these are some of the things that we have to deal when we do these cleanings. But the only thing we have to remember is we should focus on removing dust and removing urine and droppings. For any more delicate work or big stains or things like that, we should leave that to a conservator that is properly trained, especially if historic materials. They will be the ones who know how to protect the objects safely. And let's go. No? Yeah, that's another of these workshops. So you can see the one underneath. We are talking about a book, and this is, and one of them is Angela, is my colleague from the CCT, because we have done these workshops with the help of the CCT statement officer. And you can see all the people are loving what they're doing. The feedback has been really good. Let's see how much we can do. And the best thing, and I'm going to ask Diana to pass me, and this is the thing that everyone loves about the workshop. The big pole is amazing. It stands up to 4 meters. Yeah, get the mic. See, it keeps going. And it keeps going. It's the never ending. There. So you're able to clean a lot with this, and really high. Right, get that, give me the mic. So I can see people are overexcited. I could send the pole and not be there, and they will be fine. So yeah, you have that pic of everyone looking at the pole. And this is what we try to avoid, and this is what we're trying to get. So this is the before and after of one of the cleanings, in this case, a beautiful statue. And just for me to end, just remind you that we have these cleaning guidelines for churches with bad booklet that is really thorough. It touches on lots of materials, most of the materials that you can find in the church. And you'll be able to download it from our website. And not only that, but we're going to have a video cleaning tutorial for all of these, the same materials that we are touching on the book, and it's going to come out really soon in the next weeks, and it will be a lot of me talking and lots of our colleagues doing things. So thank you for everything.
It's confusing. Yeah, I'm going to use this one. I've already got it in my hand. So yes, it's me next, apparently. That's come up quickly. I don't know if I can beat Antia's energy. That was absolutely fantastic, Antia. Thank you so much. I'm just going to move this out of the way. Got 2 microphones now. So for those of you I haven't spoken to yet, my name's Kate Jones. I'm the project manager for Bats in Churches. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the project, if you haven't heard enough already. But it's going to be a bit of an overview of the day, some of my own experiences, and just a few recommendations for our legacy. And where has the clicker gone? Oh, it's right there. One second. Okay. And so, let me just... Have I got this the right way up? Oh, brilliant. Okay. Fabulous. Okay, so I'm going to start just talk a little bit about how I came to the project. So it was a bit of a surprise. It was only meant to be very temporary. Oh, I'm sorry. I was asked to apply by Jen Madrick, the development officer, a project manager, who is here today. Thank you very much, Jen. But what I always remember is that I mentioned to a project manager colleague at Natural England that I'd applied for it. I said, I've gone for Bats in Churches. Have you put an application in for that? And they said, oh, no, I wouldn't touch that with a barge pole. So what I will say today is I'm so glad that I didn't listen to them or anything they said, because this has absolutely been one of the most rewarding and fascinating experiences of my whole career. It's been absolutely amazing. It is absolutely true that I've cried a few times. That's definitely happened. But I've also laughed a great deal, and I've learned a lot more too. And a lot of that has been thanks. Come on. To people. It's the people I've worked with. It's always people at the end of the day, isn't it? I'm going to need my notes for this, but not for the whole presentation, I promise. I just don't want to forget anything at this stage. So I want to thank everyone, I suppose, that I've worked with. And it's not just the core team. It's so much more than that. It's the steering group. It's the governance board. But then beyond that, it's the ecologists. It's the architects. It's the church wardens, it's the back groups, it's the volunteers, it's the people in partnership organisations and beyond who just jumped in at the last minute to help out. Thank you, everyone. And of course, it's Heritage Fund who funded the whole thing. I started to make a list of people to thank, and I realised that we absolutely didn't have the whole afternoon. So I'm not going to say a single name. I promised I won't, but I've been supported by some absolutely wonderful people. And what has struck me more than anything is the passion and the knowledge and the dedication that I've encountered. And that has absolutely touched my heart, and it's opened my eyes as well. I've learned so much, and I'm so grateful to every single one of you. So, when I started at Bats in Churches, I was a marine ecologist and a bit of a project manager. I didn't know a lot about bats, knew a little bit, and I knew almost nothing about churches. So what I wanted to start with was just a little bit about how little I knew. Because what I found later on is, talking to friends and family, they didn't know these things either. Now I think these are basic. They're obvious. Doesn't everybody know? But I just wanted to, this is things I didn't know, a selected highlight. So a few things there. The anatomy of a church. Well, we've talked about that a lot today, but when I started at the project, all these words were flying around. Clerestory, didn't know what that was. Transept, nave, chancel, vestry, all that sort of thing. I thought the aisle went down the middle. It turns out it's on one side, both sides, or no sides. Didn't know that. So this is about speaking the language and how important that is. Another thing that was a bit of a shock, again, I'm not a religious person, scarcely been in a church, and that's not uncommon these days. I didn't know how much of the cost of running a church falls to the parish share. That was a bit of a surprise. How much effort it is to be a PCC member, to raise money, what it takes to run a church. And the other thing, of course, is how wonderful churches are. Again, not very religious person, didn't know, but wow, treasure troves of heritage, craftsmanship, and when you step inside them, some of the stories are moving or even amusing. You know, I've gone into churches and there's jokes inside, medieval jokes on the wall. Who knew? I didn't know, and that's been a fantastic discovery. And I'm ashamed to say that I'd not heard of Churches Conservation Trust. And I know now that if I see a sign for a CCT church, check it out. It's bound to be an absolute gem. So that's wonderful, and that's something I'm very glad to have learned. And of course, bats. Now, I definitely didn't know when I started the project how bad bat mess could be when you walked into a badly affected church. There's no doubt about it. I remember walking, it was Keystone, in fact, Lynn, I remember, my goodness, the smell. Didn't know. And that was really sobering and brought it home how bad it could be when it's serious. It's not always serious, of course, we know that, thank you, Claire. We know 35% of people who had bats didn't even know they were there. But when it's serious, it's serious. So again, and I think someone else has mentioned this, how different areas of the church are sensitive. I didn't know that the altar was so special. I feel like I should have known that, but in the beginning, I just didn't really. I hadn't thought about it. So this is all about language, speaking to people, getting to know churches and church people when you're working with them. And of course, bats, yeah, they're great, aren't they? They're fairy, they're wonderful, they're interesting. But my goodness, how tenacious, how inventive at getting into a carefully blocked up church they are. That was a definite point of learning. So yeah, absolutely fascinating, and how little we know about bats really as well. We know a lot. I've learned that the BCT know a fabulous amount, but we're still not quite there. It's not completely predictable. They're wild animals. They're an unknown quantity with complex behaviours. So we're still learning, absolutely. So yes, that's what I didn't know. And I will. Oh gosh, I put that up there because what I didn't expect is that when I run a recruitment for a comms officer, it would get picked up by The Independent and featured in Private Eye. I will say that Kathy's a fabulous comms officer, but to my knowledge, she cannot speak sonar. Sorry to disappoint you, Private Eye. I couldn't resist mentioning that. So yeah, this is more about what we learned as a project. So it's not just about me. This is a big multi-million-pound investment. So I think we've probably covered most of these today. This is the disadvantage of going last, isn't it? Everyone's already said this. But this is headlines and highlights. We know, thanks to the work of Claire and her team and the whole team, how many churches likely have bats, that 50%, but also a great deal more detail about that. So thank you, Claire. And the big headline message, of course, is that big mitigation, well, it can work, and we've seen today it can work, but it needs time, it needs patience, and it really needs capacity at the PCC, at the church. It needs that sort of input and patience, and it's not something to be undertaken lightly. And we've heard that as well, Sue from Braunston, how challenging faculty can be, all of this timing that needs to come together. So it's something, if you want to do it, have a careful think about it. Yeah, if it's right for you, do it. But that leads me straight to the next bullet point, I think. Often soft interventions are best. We've heard that time and time again today, and that is going to be a major part of what we take on as a piece of legacy learning. Know your bats. I love saying this. Know your bats, know your bats. This is my core advice to churches, is just get to know them. Get to know them in terms of embracing them as wonderful animals, but my goodness, get to know them in terms of what you've got if you need to do some roofing maintenance. Find out where the roost is, find out which species you've got, all that sort of thing, and it can help you in a number of ways. And I think also how effective it's been in engaging and enabling churches to connect with nature. I think, Lisa, you might have said this to me the other day, that in the beginning, there was a bit of skepticism about whether churches were going to take this on, whether churches really wanted to do nature-based events. Was it worth trying? Well, it was. We've seen today it was absolutely worth doing that. Churches have embraced it and taken it on, and in many cases it's been really effective. But again, what we've seen today is that a lot of churches still need a little bit of support when they've got bats to keep that going, to maintain that. And again, we're going to be talking a little bit more about what might be possible in the future. Definitely, I'm going to get asked, so I might as well say it, what about the BICL? So that's the Bats in Churches class licence, which the project trialled. So I've just put a few points up here. There are some ecologists here who no doubt would like to know about the BICL. There are a couple of things we found out. For those who don't know, the BICL is designed to be a little bit more flexible. It's a specialist class licence, and it allows ecologists the freedom to implement slightly more novel bat mitigation methods at churches. As we've seen today, a lot of them have really gone for that. We've had some really interesting approaches. We think that the BICL applications can be a little bit more streamlined than a standard mitigation licence. This is just what we're finding. We have had a little bit of feedback about the survey requirements on the BICL, and we are looking at that as a Natural England to see whether we can include a little bit more flexibility on that in the future. That's something we're reviewing, and we'll see where we go with that, but that's some feedback that we've had and that we're listening to. I will give a quick plug. It's about to be announced, but we're doing some training for Bats in Churches class licence. That's for ecologists, and that is going to be on the 1st and 2nd of November. So we'll be announcing that on our website and our social media soon. Look out for it if you'd like to come, or if you know someone who might benefit from doing the BICL training. And yeah, I put this on here because I do get asked about earned recognition quite a bit by ecologists. We are hoping to incorporate aspects of the BICL into earned recognition. I can't say a lot about that yet, but it is something we're looking at and we feel quite positive about it. There we go. So I think I'll skim over this because we've heard quite a lot about this. The discussion was really good, and I think we've probably covered a lot of these. More training, Bat Advice Service. BCT are going to take on the Challenge Badge. That's the lovely little badge for children to do, uniform groups, forest schools, that kind of thing. I think we've had over 300 of those badges that have gone out already, so that's 300 children who've done those activities, gone home and told their parents about it, that kind of thing. So we're really pleased BCT are going to take that on. Thank you so much. Churches Conservation Trust are going to be the new owners of Little Church Bat. They're going to host our website, so thank you very much, CCT. And I think we've already heard this from Emily, looking into options at Church of England around embedding various learning. And the small grant scheme, so I don't want to repeat myself, we've already heard about this. It's something that we're going to be looking at in the coming months. And I don't know if I need to do this actually, because we've already heard about it, but I put a summary here of what we are looking at in terms of this maintenance management grant. It's definitely still an idea, but this is as discussed during the panel session, small amounts, 500, maybe £1,000, depending, to help with soft interventions, and in exchange for that, some sort of community activity. So we will certainly be exploring that together as a partnership. I'm certainly reassured by the conversations this afternoon that we'll be doing that. So, yeah, a few recommendations. I've done this loosely grouped. These are, again, headlines. All this should be pretty self-evident. I'm wrapping up, really. Churches, if you think you've got bats, it's good to make sure. So presence-absence surveys, we've heard today that some of those will be offered, in fact, through the Bat Advice Service. So that's a question of calling the helpline to see if you can arrange one of those, know if you've got bats or not. And then, as I've said a number of times, get to know your bats, maybe carry out something yourself, make a note of where the roost is, when do your bats normally arrive, where are the droppings, those kind of things. It will help you if you want to do any work. And it's also just really nice to know, isn't it? And then engagement locally. If you can engage an ecologist, if you can engage a bat group, that is all to the good, and it might help you hold events, community events like we've seen today. Okay. Yes. So bat workers, that's, I think, some BBRVs in the churchyard of Braunston on the right-hand side there. So again, this is all pretty self-evident if you've been sitting here all day, but do try and get involved at a local church with bats. If you haven't, please, if you're a bat worker, do engage. Learn to speak the language. Learn to know how Church of England works. We've heard about faculty and permissions today, and actually just knowing a bit about that and being able to have those positive conversations, being on the same page as the church you're working with, can make a really big difference. Could you, if you're a bat worker, take on a local church and make it part of the National Bat Monitoring Programme? And again, it would be great. We'd love to get more churches into the NBMP if we can. If that's something that might interest you, get in touch with BCT and the NBMP and see if you can take that forward. That would be wonderful. And if you are thinking about working with a church as a bat person, we do have some working with churches e-learning modules on our website. So that's really what I've been talking about all day, communication, language, all that sort of thing, but how to work well and effectively with churches. I popped a couple of points on here just to reflect what we've heard from our churches around funding. So this is really, I suppose, what we've heard churches would like to see or considered from funders. This is, and the bullet point at the top is probably the big one. It's about funding, and Kit, I think you mentioned this. When a church wants to start a project or a bit of works, whether it's roofing or whether it's bat mitigation, you normally have to have surveys, and they're not normally covered by funders, and that is a big gap. And in some cases, churches don't go forward with that work or are not able to go forward because there's not help with those initial costs of getting a good ecologist in, getting some quality surveys done, and getting a good BAT management plan together that can help to make sure those works go really well. So there is a definite plea there to funders to have a think about bridging that gap. It could make a real difference in some cases. And there's some fairly obvious ones on there that we've already heard about: seasonality, more flexibility with timescales if possible, and that is because of the unpredictable nature of working with bats. The seasonality in the maternity season and hibernation, weather dependent, and there are loads of other things there around permissions as well and timescales. We've heard today again and again, things don't always go to time, and some funding is often quite stringently time-based. So there has been a plea there for a little bit more flexibility from funders on that front. And I would just mention as well, it's often the case that you cannot apply for the same thing again, and some churches do need the same thing again or something a lot like it to help them look after their heritage and help to maintain it long term. So again, that's just something we've heard and we're feeding back, but we do think that that would be a real help to churches who want to look after their building and their heritage but just need a little bit of help. So yeah, the partnership, our wonderful partnership. A few things on there, and these are recommendations from the project. We have said, and it's a fairly straightforward one, that Natural England Wildlife Licensing Service may want to consider running another Bats and Churches class license training in a couple of years' time. We ran one at the start of the project. As I've just said, we're running another one in early November this year. So there's perhaps something there for Newells to consider in a couple of years, whether we want to look at that again, just to keep that fresh and live. It will be a really nice thing to do as part of our legacy. I think we heard from Emily this afternoon that COV is doing quite a lot to embed. But yeah, just a recommendation to keep signposting and embedding as much of our learning into core guidance as possible so that churches know what to do if they've got bats. So yeah, thank you, Emily, for being so clear on that. And oh, I will say this, I would really like it if someone took on our schools programme. It's an absolutely brilliant programme that was put together by Rose, who's been absolutely fantastic on the project. As a number of people have said today, I'm going to embarrass you, Rose, you've been absolutely fabulous. The schools programme is great. It works really well. We get amazing feedback. It's completely curriculum aligned. Teachers love it. It covers bats and it covers heritage, and the children explore their local church. And actually what we've heard is quite often it's the church they're excited about because they've never been in it before. So it's just fantastic on all levels, and I think it would be absolutely wonderful if that could go ahead. It doesn't cost a lot. All the development's done. So there's a plea there to the partnership to consider whether we could fund that. It's not expensive, and it would be a real shame to lose it. Yeah, this is all self-evident really after today, but we should work together in these final months to explore the possibility of the small grant scheme pilot. I do feel quite positive about the conversations we've had today, but of course we must always wait and see. But what I would say is that the Legacy Group, if that pilot is successful, I think it's really important that the Legacy Group are there, which they will be, and review that in the future to see what can be learned from it, and again, what we can keep taking forward. I think Jen Heathcott said how long this sort of partnership has been around. It's not just about the project. Well, let's keep that going and keep it going and keep those conversations going. And I think that's it, really. Let's work together. Encourage positive narratives about living alongside bats where possible. And I must acknowledge some of the churches today, it's not always been possible to have that soft intervention. Sometimes you do need major work, but for most churches, the narrative is now that you can live alongside your bats, and often it can be a real asset, a very positive thing, and to remain very open to future collaborative working. So this is the bit where I say thank you. As I've said, I can't thank everybody, but I would like to thank my team who've been wonderful. There they are, aren't they absolutely fantastic? I've been absolutely privileged to work with some wonderful people. So yeah, I will finish saying thank you to them, and a huge thank you, of course, to Heritage Fund and to all the lottery players without whom we wouldn't be here and we couldn't have done this. So thank you very much. So now, for closing remarks and final words, I am going to pass over to Archdeacon Vernon Ross, who sits on our governance board. Vernon, thank you so much for being here today. I think you're slide free, aren't you? I think it's good, it's rolling. Okay, right. In that case, everyone please welcome Vernon, who is going to close in style.
Yeah, cool. I'm Vernon. I work for Supernatural England, which is my phrase for the Church of England. I've learned so much being in this project, learned so much today about the importance of working together. We've got such a big climate crisis, but isn't it amazing when different groups come together, work together, what difference we can make, that small works as well as big. That the Church of England is difficult to understand for those on the outside. I want to reassure you that for those of us in the inside, it's also difficult to understand. But I think we're going to have to learn to speed up our processes. I've learned, I think, that it's really good to have good ecologists and good architects working together, that they're worth their money, and that church wardens and PCC do absolutely amazing work. I guess I want to talk about theology, because you think from an archdeacon you'll get a bit of a God slot, but it'll be quite a gentle God slot, and hopefully you'll stay awake during it. So, from a Christian perspective, you know, creation is amazing. It is stunning that we are part of God's creation. Nature is community, and valuing churches as natural places, as historical places, as sacred places, yes, but also as places where nature can thrive, and maybe to see churchyards more as green spaces and less as manicured lawns. Personally, the project matters to me as a Christian because ecology is important. I'm also a biology graduate, so I'm biased. I'm an amateur wildlife photographer, and I like taking pictures of wildlife. And I'm also a conservation volunteer up in Cumbria. And I don't see any of these as separate elements of my life. They all work together. The Christian tradition is clear that the earth is God's, that humankind is part of creation, that we as humans have a particular call to care for all of creation, to nurture for it, that creation has value and worth in its own right. I live in the Lake District. The house next to us is in the Lake District. The house beyond that is not. So it's a bit of smug, really, that we're just in it. But the Lake District is a heavily commodified part of creation. And actually, life on Earth, fauna and flora, is not a commodity. It has value in itself. It's worth having for what it is. Bats are valuable. And the Sabbath, the principle of the Sabbath, the rest, is about putting a handbrake on 24/7 commercialization and exploitation of people and creation. First and foremost, creation belongs to the Creator. We have it on loan. The story of Noah and the ark ends with God making a covenant, not just with Noah and his family, but with every living creature on earth. That's such a big sign. Every living creature matters to God. Simply put, we're called to be in a good and right relationship with God, with each other, and with creation. And when we see this break down, we see the environmental destruction that we're facing today, we see destruction of ecosystems, and we see the challenge of climate change. So the disconnect between humankind, God, and creation matters. It leads to injustice, it leads to destruction. The physical matters to God. It's not just about a spiritual bit over there and a physical bit here. It's all interlinked. Christian life and Christian values, for those of you who do go to church, must be lived out in practice. The physical world matters in every possible way. Ultimately, how I care for creation, how I care for my fellow human beings, is as much an act of worship for me as singing a hymn or saying a prayer. I would like to say to conservationists the following, that actually do treat and see the church as an ally in conservation and not as a potential enemy. For people who go to church, actually see ecologists as good news. They're not annoying pests. They are good news and can actually give us the expertise that we need to help to care for the environment around us. I want to say this as well for Anglicans. The fifth mark of mission is about caring for the environment. So actually, let's do it. Bats are a protected species, and churches are beautiful, sacred spaces. We've seen some amazing buildings on the slides today. The challenge here is offering sanctuary to creatures whose habits have been degraded by human beings and protecting both the bat community, the worshipping community, and the local community. And this can be achieved through partnerships that we've heard all about today, how we can work together. About education, so do pick up that schools pack and encourage it. It's really important, and about working together. Bats in your church can be an engagement opportunity with the wider community, reaching out to new people in the community who might not even consider coming to church at all and not realise the value of the church as an environmental place. Why not put on a bat walk? Why not get your local youth group involved in church? Get involved as well with other things that are related on the environmental front. Caring for God's Acre, the A Rocha Eco Church project, Go for Gold, where you actually become carbon neutral as well. For Tear Fund's work on climate change and climate justice and living sustainably. I want to end by thanking the entire team involved with bats in churches. I'm not going to name you, because whenever you start naming people, you always forget someone at the end of it. So thank you all for the work that you've done. And it's been an inspiration to see a commitment of so many humans to such a small mammal working constructively in a difficult world. It is a difficult world of historic buildings, and church congregations can be difficult, local communities can be difficult, we all can be difficult. So do go away, be inspired, and for those of you who are Christians, actually start realizing that caring for the environment is a fundamental part of our faith. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vernon, for closing us out like that. That was really touching. Thank you. That is the end of our day, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for being here. Oh, Honor, is there extra food? Is that what you're indicating? Help yourself to food on the way out, but do stay, have a look around, feel free to chat. For the next hour, we'll be here, and then we're heading off. So thank you all for being here, and thank you for a wonderful day.